The letter was hidden inside a wall that should never have contained anything at all. It appeared on a grey morning 6 days after Edgar Vailcrest left Blackmere Hall under guard, carrying the last fragments of his dignity and far too many unanswered questions. Rain drifted across the cliffs beyond the estate in thin silver sheets while workers repaired water damage inside one of the oldest wings of the manor. The discovery would have remained insignificant if the carpenter had not recognized the seal pressed into the folded parchment. By noon, the letter sat unopened on Theodore Ravenshade's desk. By 1 o'clock, everything had changed. Lillian stood near the library windows overlooking the lake when Mrs. Norwood arrived carrying a polished silver tray. The older woman moved with her usual calm efficiency, but something about the way she held herself immediately drew attention. Theodore noticed it first. He always noticed things first. He lowered the document he had been reviewing and looked toward her. What happened? Mrs. Norwood set the tray carefully upon the desk. Resting at its center was a single folded letter yellowed by age. The restoration crew found this sealed inside the west corridor wall. Theodore's eyes narrowed slightly. Inside the wall? Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Norwood glanced briefly toward Lillian. The seal may interest you. Lillian stepped closer without realizing she had moved. Theodore reached toward the letter and turned it slowly beneath the afternoon light. The room became very quiet. A familiar crest had been pressed into dark red wax. A raven surrounded by thorned branches. Blackmere. Theodore stared at it for several seconds. Not speaking. Not moving. Something changed behind his eyes. Not surprise. Recognition. Lillian felt her pulse quicken immediately. You know what it is. Theodore lifted his gaze toward her. I know what it should not be. He broke the seal. The crack of hardened wax seemed unnaturally loud inside the library. Mrs. Norwood remained motionless near the desk. Lillian moved closer still. Theodore unfolded the parchment carefully. His expression remained unreadable through the first few lines. Then his jaw tightened. Only slightly, but enough. Lillian saw it. Mrs. Norwood saw it too. Theodore. His eyes remained fixed on the page. When was this section of the manor sealed? Mrs. Norwood answered immediately. Shortly after the fire 20 years ago. Silence followed. Cold silence. Theodore read farther. Then again from the beginning. Slowly this time. His face revealed nothing. Yet the atmosphere inside the room shifted all the same. Lillian felt it immediately. The same feeling she experienced whenever another piece of the past surfaced. The sensation that invisible threads were tightening around events she still could not fully understand. What does it say? She asked quietly. Theodore did not answer right away. He folded the letter once, then unfolded it again. Finally he looked toward her. Something troubled lived behind the calm control he usually maintained so carefully. You should read it yourself. He handed her the parchment. Lillian accepted it with trembling fingers. The paper felt fragile, ancient, as though it had survived years waiting for exactly this moment. The handwriting slanted sharply across the page. Elegant, precise. The ink had faded, but not enough to hide the words. If this letter reaches Theodore Ravenshade, then God has granted more mercy than I deserve. Lillian felt her breath catch softly. She continued reading. The fire was not an accident. Someone inside Blackmere opened the doors that night. Someone wanted House Vale erased. I do not know how much time remains before they discover what I have done. The child must survive. Eleanor must never return until the truth is uncovered. The room seemed to tilt slightly around her. Eleanor. Her eyes moved faster across the page. If Theodore is reading this, then I beg him to remember his promise. Protect her, no matter what becomes of me. The signature at the bottom had nearly disappeared with age. Yet enough remained visible. Lillian stared at it. Her pulse hammered unevenly beneath her ribs. Theodore watched her face carefully. Too carefully. Who wrote it? She whispered. Theodore stepped closer. Turn the page over. Her fingers obeyed automatically. Something else had been written across the back. Only 3 words. Not a sentence. Not an explanation. A warning. She stared at the faded ink, then read it aloud before she could stop herself. Trust no Ashcroft. Silence crashed through the library. Mrs. Norwood inhaled sharply. Theodore's expression hardened instantly. Not dramatically, like steel cooling. Lillian looked up. Ashcroft. Theodore took the letter gently from her hands. His attention remained fixed on the warning. That name has not appeared in 20 years. Who are they? Theodore did not answer immediately. Outside, rain drifted across the lake while distant thunder rolled beyond the mountains. The silence stretched. The Ashcrofts were connected to House Vale before the fire. Lillian felt unease settle deeper inside her chest. Connected how? Theodore folded the letter carefully. Too carefully. Through business. Through politics. Through marriage negotiations. Mrs. Norwood's expression had gone unusually pale. Lillian noticed immediately. You know the name too. The older woman hesitated. Rare for her. Very rare. Only from old conversations after the fire. Theodore turned toward the windows overlooking the cliffs. His posture remained controlled. Yet tension had become visible across his shoulders. Lillian studied him carefully. She had learned enough during the past week to recognize what the signs meant. Theodore Ravenshade was worried. Not frightened. Not uncertain. Worried. Which somehow felt worse. There is more. Theodore spoke quietly without turning around. The signature. Lillian waited. Theodore finally faced her again. It belongs to Abigail Hartwell. The name meant nothing to her. Theodore saw her confusion immediately. She was your nurse. Lillian stared at him. My nurse. Before the fire. A strange sensation moved through her chest. The feeling of standing near memories she could not quite reach. Theodore continued. Abigail disappeared the same night you vanished. Lillian looked toward the letter again. You think she wrote this before she died? Theodore's gaze lowered briefly. No. No. I think she wrote it before she took you away. The room fell silent once more. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows. Somewhere deeper inside Blackmere Hall, a clock chimed the hour. Lillian moved slowly toward one of the leather chairs near the fireplace and lowered herself into it. Her thoughts felt tangled beyond order now. Abigail Hartwell. A hidden letter. Promise. A warning. Trust no Ashcroft. Every answer seemed to create 3 more questions. Theodore crossed toward the fireplace and rested one hand against the mantel. For several moments neither of them spoke. Finally Lillian broke the silence. You knew my family before the fire. Theodore's eyes lifted toward hers. Yes. And you made a promise. Another pause. Longer this time. Theodore rarely avoided direct questions. The hesitation itself felt meaningful. Yes. Lillian studied him carefully. What kind of promise? The fire crackled softly between them. Theodore looked toward the flames. Not because he wished to avoid her gaze. Because some memories remained difficult even after 20 years. The kind a boy makes when he believes he can protect everyone. Something tightened inside her chest at the quiet honesty in his voice. Theodore rarely spoke about himself. Even now, his words revealed very little. Yet somehow they revealed enough. You were there that night. Theodore nodded once. Yes. Lillian swallowed carefully. And you could not stop it. For the first time since she met him, genuine pain crossed his face without immediately disappearing behind control. It lasted only a second. Maybe less. But she saw it. No, he said softly. I could not. The answer settled heavily between them. Mrs. Norwood quietly excused herself a few moments later, leaving the library in respectful silence. Neither Theodore nor Lillian noticed her departure immediately. Their attention remained fixed elsewhere. On the past. On promises. On ghosts. Outside, the storm slowly intensified. Wind brushed against the windows overlooking the lake. Shadows shifted across the shelves lining the library walls. Theodore eventually crossed back toward the desk and opened one of its lower drawers. He removed a leather folder. Dark blue. Worn from years of use. Lillian watched him place it carefully upon the desk. What is that? Theodore rested one hand against the cover. Everything I collected while searching for you. Her pulse stumbled. Theodore opened the folder. Inside rested dozens of documents. Photographs, maps, newspaper clippings, investigation notes written in his precise handwriting. 20 years of searching compressed into a single collection. Lillian stared silently. Theodore removed one photograph and handed it to her. She accepted it carefully. The image showed a woman standing outside a train station. Dark hair, sharp eyes, serious expression. Something about her face felt strangely familiar. Who is she? Theodore's voice lowered almost imperceptibly. Abigail Hartwell. Lillian looked back down at the photograph. The woman who saved her. Or stole her. Or both. She no longer knew which possibility frightened her more. Then she noticed something else. A symbol pinned discreetly to Abigail's coat. A small silver brooch, shaped like a lily. Her breath caught softly. Theodore noticed immediately. What is it? Lillian pointed toward the image. The brooch. Theodore leaned closer. His expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. You recognize it? Lillian nodded slowly. I have one. Silence fell again. Theodore stared at her. What? Lillian rose from the chair immediately. Her heartbeat accelerated with every step toward the door. Wait here. She crossed the hallway and disappeared toward her rooms in the East Wing. Theodore remained motionless for exactly 3 seconds, then followed. By the time he reached her sitting room, Lillian was already opening a small wooden box stored inside a drawer beside her bed. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted its contents. A silver brooch, worn with age, shaped like a lily. Theodore stopped beside her. Neither spoke. The resemblance was unmistakable. Lillian looked from the brooch in her hand to the photograph resting in Theodore's grasp. The same design, the same craftsmanship, the same symbol. Margaret always said it belonged to my grandmother. Her voice sounded distant even to herself. Theodore stared at the brooch, then at her, then back at the photograph. Something dangerous settled quietly behind his eyes. No. Lillian felt cold move through her chest. What? Theodore's gaze remained fixed on the silver flower. I think it belonged to Abigail. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the silence heavier. Outside, thunder rolled again above Blackmere Hall. Theodore accepted the brooch carefully from her hand and turned it beneath the light. Something caught his attention almost immediately. A faint engraving hidden along the back. Tiny letters, nearly invisible. Lillian moved closer. Theodore read them aloud. For Eleanor, if I cannot return. Neither of them spoke afterward. They simply stared at the inscription while the storm gathered strength beyond the windows and the shadows of the past moved one step closer to the present. And somewhere inside Blackmere Hall, a hidden letter had finally begun telling the truth. The storm remained over Blackmere Hall long after nightfall. Wind moved across the cliffs in restless waves while rain drifted against the tall windows overlooking the lake. Most of the estate had settled into silence hours earlier, yet the lights inside Theodore's library still burned. Lillian sat beside the fireplace with the silver brooch resting carefully in her hands. She had read the engraving at least 20 times since discovering it. The words had not changed, neither had the questions. For Eleanor, if I cannot return. Theodore stood near the desk reviewing documents from the blue folder once again. He had barely spoken during the past hour. Not because he wished to avoid conversation, because his attention had shifted entirely toward something larger. Lillian recognized the pattern now. Whenever Theodore became this quiet, he was solving a problem, or preparing for one. The fire crackled softly between them. Shadows moved across the bookshelves. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the mountains. Finally Lillian broke the silence. You knew this brooch belonged to Abigail the moment you saw it. Theodore glanced up from the papers. No. She waited. I suspected. He lowered the document in his hand. Abigail always wore a silver lily. Lillian looked down at the brooch again. The worn metal reflected the firelight in soft flashes. Then why give it to me? Theodore's gaze shifted toward the flames. That depends on when she gave it to you. The answer settled heavily in the room. Because neither of them knew. Lillian remembered the box. She remembered finding it among her childhood belongings years ago. Yet she could not remember when it first appeared. Only that Margaret had always dismissed questions about it. Another small mystery hidden among hundreds of others. Theodore closed the folder and crossed toward the fireplace. There is something else. His tone immediately captured her attention. What? He rested one hand against the mantel. Abigail never traveled alone. Lillian looked up. What does that mean? It means if she took you away from the fire, someone helped her. The realization landed instantly. Another missing piece. Another unknown figure moving through the shadows of her past. Theodore continued. For 20 years I assumed she disappeared because she was protecting you. And now, Theodore's expression hardened slightly. Now I think she may have been hiding from someone. Silence followed. Lillian stared into the flames. Every answer seemed to reveal a deeper danger beneath it. The fire had not been an accident. Someone wanted House Vale erased. Someone wanted Eleanor dead. Someone had hidden her under another name. And someone else had spent 20 years searching for her. The scale of it all felt overwhelming. A knock interrupted the silence. 3 measured knocks. Theodore's attention shifted instantly toward the door. Enter. Mrs. Norwood stepped inside carrying a sealed envelope. Her expression remained composed, though something unusual flickered beneath the surface. Your Grace. Theodore accepted the envelope immediately. What is it? A courier arrived from Boston less than 30 minutes ago. Theodore examined the seal. Lillian noticed his posture change at once. Not dramatically, but enough. Recognition again. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The room grew still. Lillian watched his eyes move across the page. Once, then again. More slowly. Mrs. Norwood remained near the doorway. Waiting. Theodore finally lowered the letter. When did this arrive? Just after sunset. Theodore nodded once. Thank you. Mrs. Norwood quietly withdrew. The library doors closed behind her. Lillian waited until the silence returned. Boston. Theodore looked toward her. Yes. The place where you confirmed my identity. Something softened briefly in his expression. Yes. She rose from her chair. What does the letter say? Theodore hesitated. Rare. Very rare. A lawyer is coming to Blackmere Hall. Lillian frowned slightly. A lawyer. Theodore handed her the letter. Read the second paragraph. She accepted it carefully. The handwriting differed from Abigail's. Precise. Formal. Professional. Her eyes moved down the page until they reached the section Theodore referenced. Then she stopped breathing for a moment. Miss Eleanor Catherine Vale has been identified as the sole surviving beneficiary named within the final trust documents of House Vale. Lillian stared at the words. Then read them again. The fire seemed distant suddenly. The room itself seemed distant. Sole surviving beneficiary. She lifted her eyes slowly. Theodore watched her carefully. I do not understand. His voice remained calm. I know. She looked back down. The letter continued. Due to recent developments concerning her confirmed identity, immediate legal review of inheritance holdings is required. Lillian lowered the paper. Her pulse had begun hammering again. Inheritance. Theodore nodded once. Yes. The single word changed everything. She crossed slowly toward the nearest window overlooking the lake. Rain slid across the glass in silver streams. Inheritance. The concept felt unreal. Her entire life had been defined by scarcity. Not poverty exactly, but never importance. Never significance. She had been tolerated inside Valecrest Manor. Forgotten whenever possible. Invisible at social gatherings. Yet now documents were appearing from hidden walls. Lawyers were traveling across states. And people seemed increasingly certain she belonged to a world she had never known existed. How much? The question escaped before she could stop it. Theodore did not answer immediately. She turned toward him. How much is this inheritance? Theodore's expression remained unreadable. I do not know. You do. A faint shadow of amusement touched his eyes. Very faint. Some of it. Lillian folded her arms. Theodore. His gaze remained fixed on her. House Vale controlled more than Blackmere interests before the fire. Her heartbeat quickened. How much more? Theodore exhaled slowly. Several properties. That tells me nothing. Rail holdings. Nothing. Shipping contracts. She stared. Theodore continued anyway. Land investments. Trust funds. International accounts. The room felt smaller with every word. Lillian looked away first. Not because she doubted him, because she suddenly understood why someone might have wanted a child erased from history. Theodore watched understanding spread across her face. Yes. She looked back toward him. You think someone stole it? I think someone benefited from your disappearance. Silence settled once more. Deep silence. Outside, lightning briefly illuminated the lake below the cliffs. Lillian pressed one hand against the cool glass beside her. The reflection staring back looked unfamiliar somehow. Not because she had changed, because her understanding of herself had. Eleanor Vale. Surviving heir. Hidden child. Missing inheritance. Nothing felt stable anymore. Theodore crossed toward her carefully. Not close enough to crowd her. Close enough that she would not feel alone. The lawyer arrives tomorrow afternoon. She nodded faintly. And then we learn what remains. The answer should have comforted her. Instead it deepened her unease. Because another question had already formed. Theodore noticed immediately. Of course he noticed. What are you thinking? Lillian looked toward the rain-dark lake. If there is an inheritance. Her voice lowered. Then someone has spent 20 years protecting it. Theodore's expression hardened. Or hiding it. She swallowed carefully. Which means they may not be happy that I am alive. Silence answered first. Then Theodore spoke quietly. No. She turned toward him. The certainty in his eyes unsettled her. They will not. Thunder rolled again beyond the mountains. The fire crackled softly behind them. Theodore remained perfectly still for several seconds before speaking once more. There is another problem. Lillian almost laughed. Another problem. The phrase felt absurd now. What? Theodore reached toward the desk and picked up the letter from Boston. Then he unfolded the final page. The lawyer is not coming alone. Lillian frowned. Who is with him? Theodore's gaze lowered toward the name written near the bottom. The change in his expression happened instantly. Cold. Controlled. Dangerous. Lillian felt unease tighten inside her chest. Theodore. He lifted his eyes toward hers. And Ashcroft. The room fell silent. Completely silent. Rain continued tapping against the windows. The fire burned low behind them. Neither seemed to notice. Lillian stared at him. You mean the same family from Abigail's warning? Yes. Trust no Ashcroft. Theodore nodded once. Exactly. A chill moved through her despite the warmth of the room. The name had appeared twice now. Once hidden inside a letter sealed for 20 years. And now inside legal documents connected to her inheritance. That could not be coincidence. Theodore seemed to reach the same conclusion. His attention shifted toward the storm beyond the windows. They know you are alive. Lillian's pulse stumbled. How? Theodore looked back toward her. Because tomorrow one of them is coming to Blackmere Hall. Neither spoke afterward. They simply stood together while the storm gathered strength around the estate and a new threat stepped quietly out of the past. Somewhere beyond the mountains, a lawyer and an Ashcroft were already traveling toward Blackmere. And for the first time since discovering the hidden letter, Lillian felt certain of one thing. The inheritance was never going to be the real battle. The real battle was learning why someone had spent 20 years making sure it never reached her. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of silver ash. The storm had weakened during the night, leaving mist drifting across the lake below Blackmere Hall and clouds tangled among the distant mountain ridges. Lillian had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the same words returned. Sole surviving beneficiary. Trust no Ashcroft. The thoughts circled endlessly through her mind until dawn finally pushed pale light across her bedroom walls. By 8 o'clock, she stood beside the windows of the east wing, sitting room watching fog move slowly across the water. Somewhere below, servants crossed the courtyard preparing for arriving guests. The lawyer from Boston. And the Ashcroft. Even now the name felt strange. Dangerous in a way she could not explain. A soft knock sounded against the door behind her. Enter. Mrs. Norwood stepped inside carrying a breakfast tray. Her expression remained calm as always, though Lillian noticed a trace of concern beneath the composure. You have not eaten properly since yesterday. Lillian managed a faint smile. Everyone keeps telling me that. Mrs. Norwood placed the tray near the fireplace. That is because everyone is correct. The older woman hesitated briefly before adding, His Grace has not eaten much either. Lillian looked away toward the windows. Theodore had spent most of the night in the library reviewing records from the investigation folder. She knew because she had seen the light beneath the library doors long after midnight. Did he sleep at all? Mrs. Norwood's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Not enough. Lillian lowered her gaze. Something tightened quietly inside her chest. During the past week she had learned many things about Theodore Ravenshade. He rarely complained, rarely rested, rarely allowed himself weakness. Yet somehow every new discovery revealed just how much of his life had been consumed by a promise made 20 years ago. Before she could speak again, another knock echoed through the room, this one sharper, more urgent. Mrs. Norwood turned immediately. Come in. A young footman entered and bowed quickly. Your Grace requests Miss Veilcrest in the library. Lillian's pulse quickened at once. Theodore never summoned people without reason. Did something happen? The footman hesitated. A telegram arrived from Charleston. The room seemed colder suddenly. Lillian exchanged a glance with Mrs. Norwood. Charleston, the city where her life had existed before everything changed. Thank you. The servant withdrew. Moments later, Lillian crossed the halls of Blackmere Hall toward the library. The estate felt unusually quiet this morning. Not peaceful, expectant, as though everyone sensed important events approaching. She found Theodore standing beside the desk when she entered. Several documents lay spread before him. His coat remained draped across a nearby chair. The sleeves of his white shirt were rolled slightly upward, a rare sign that he had been working for hours. He looked up the moment she entered. Exhaustion shadowed his eyes. Determination remained stronger. You wanted to see me? Theodore nodded once. A telegram arrived from Charleston before dawn. He handed her the paper. Lillian accepted it carefully. The message was short. Too short. Records located. St. Augustine Hospital birth registry altered. Original files missing. One witness alive. Her pulse stumbled. She read the words again. Then a third time. The hospital records. Theodore's gaze remained fixed on her. Someone changed them. The confirmation should not have surprised her anymore. Yet somehow it did. A lifetime of assumptions continued collapsing one piece at a time. The witness. Her voice sounded softer than intended. Who is it? Theodore crossed toward the window overlooking the lake. A retired records clerk. And they are still alive? Apparently. Lillian folded the telegram carefully. Hope and fear collided uneasily inside her chest. For the first time, there might be someone capable of explaining what happened after the fire. Someone who remembered. Someone who knew the truth. Theodore seemed to sense exactly where her thoughts had gone. Do not expect certainty yet. She looked toward him. You think they may not know much. I think 20 years changes memories. The answer was practical. Sensible. Yet she noticed he had not dismissed the possibility entirely, which meant the lead mattered. A great deal. Theodore turned back toward the desk. I have already arranged transportation. Lillian blinked. Transportation? To Charleston. Surprise moved through her immediately. You are leaving? We are leaving. The correction landed softly. Yet it warmed something inside her all the same. Theodore crossed toward the fireplace. If the witness is willing to speak, we need answers before word spreads. Lillian understood at once. The inheritance, the Ashcrofts, the hidden letters. Every new revelation increased the risk that others would begin searching too. She lowered her eyes briefly toward the telegram. When do we leave? Tomorrow morning. The answer came without hesitation. Of course it did. Theodore never delayed action once a path became clear. Silence settled between them. Comfortable silence this time. Rare. Lillian found herself studying him across the room. The dark hair slightly disordered from lack of sleep. The faint tension near his eyes. The quiet focus that never seemed to disappear. 20 years. She still struggled to understand the scale of it. 20 years spent searching for someone everyone else believed dead. Theodore noticed her watching him. His expression shifted slightly. What is it? Lillian hesitated, then asked the question anyway. Why Boston? He looked genuinely surprised. What? You said Boston confirmed my identity 3 years ago. Theodore remained silent for several seconds, then slowly crossed toward one of the shelves lining the library wall. He removed a narrow leather notebook and handed it to her. Open it. Lillian obeyed. Inside were investigation notes, maps, names, dates, hundreds of entries written in Theodore's precise handwriting. She turned several pages before stopping. A photograph rested between two sheets. A younger version of herself stood outside a charity concert hall. Snow covered the sidewalks around her. She looked perhaps 3 years younger. Serious, quiet, unaware she was being photographed. Lillian stared. Boston. Theodore nodded. You played piano that evening. Memory surfaced immediately. A winter fundraiser. An absent performer. A last-minute request. Claire de Lune. The same piece she later discovered waiting in Blackmere Hall. Theodore watched recognition spread across her face. You were there. Yes. She lowered her gaze toward the photograph. And you knew. Theodore's expression tightened faintly. Not completely. But enough. He did not deny it. Silence followed. Lillian carefully closed the notebook. The realization felt strangely intimate. Not because Theodore had watched her. Because he had remembered. Every detail. Every clue. Every possibility. He had built 20 years of his life around fragments that might have led nowhere. Yet he never stopped. A knock interrupted the moment. 3 sharp knocks. The doors opened almost immediately afterward. Mrs. Norwood entered. Your Grace. Theodore straightened at once. They arrived. The words changed the atmosphere instantly. The lawyer. The Ashcroft. Lillian felt her pulse accelerate. Theodore's expression became unreadable again. Controlled. Reserved. The Duke returning to the surface. Bring them to the receiving room. Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Norwood withdrew. Silence followed her departure. Theodore looked toward Lillian. For several moments neither spoke. Then quietly, You do not have to attend if you prefer not to. She almost laughed. 24 hours earlier she might have accepted the escape. Not now. Not after hidden letters. Not after inheritance documents. Not after Charleston records. No. Her voice remained steady. I want to hear everything. Something warm flickered briefly in Theodore's eyes. Pride perhaps. Respect. Then it vanished behind composure. He offered his arm. The gesture startled her. Not because it was improper. Because it felt unexpectedly personal. Lillian hesitated only a second before placing her hand lightly against his sleeve. Theodore guided her toward the hallway. Together they crossed the manor in silence. Sunlight finally began breaking through the clouds outside. Thin beams of gold touched the lake below the cliffs. Servants moved quietly throughout the estate. Somewhere distant, a clock marked the hour. The receiving room doors stood open when they arrived. 2 men waited inside. One was elderly, thin, formal, almost certainly the lawyer. The second man stood near the windows overlooking the eastern grounds. Tall, dark-haired, impeccably dressed. He turned the moment they entered. The room seemed to still around him. Lillian felt her breath catch softly. Not because of appearance. Because of recognition. She had never seen him before. Yet the silver pin fastened to his lapel carried the same symbol stamped onto an old legal document Theodore showed her earlier that morning. Ashcroft. The man inclined his head politely. His expression remained calm, respectful, difficult to read. Then his eyes settled fully upon her. Something changed there, just briefly. Surprise. Genuine surprise. As though he had expected many things upon arriving at Blackmere Hall. But not her. Miss Vale. His voice was quiet, controlled. You look exactly like your mother. The silence that followed felt almost alive. And for the first time since hearing the name Ashcroft, Lillian realized the danger might not come from strangers searching for her. It might come from people who already knew exactly who she was. The words settled over the receiving room with unsettling weight. You look exactly like your mother. Lillian remained still beside Theodore while sunlight filtered through the tall windows behind them. For one suspended moment, no one spoke. The older lawyer lowered his eyes toward the documents in his hands. Theodore's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. The Ashcroft man seemed to realize exactly what he had revealed. Yet he did not attempt to retract it. "You knew her." Lillian heard her own voice before she consciously decided to speak. The man held her gaze steadily. "Yes." Theodore moved slightly closer beside her. The motion was subtle, protective, instinctive. "Explain." The single word landed quietly. Yet it transformed the atmosphere of the room immediately. The Ashcroft man inclined his head. "My name is Nathaniel Ashcroft." His attention shifted briefly toward Theodore. "And I understand why you are cautious." Theodore's expression suggested the statement was an understatement. Nathaniel seemed unsurprised. He folded his hands behind his back and looked toward Lillian again. "I knew your mother before the fire." Lillian's pulse quickened. Not Margaret. Not the woman who raised her. Her mother. The one she had never known. "Tell me her name." Nathaniel hesitated. Only briefly. "Charlotte Vale." The room seemed to narrow around the answer. Charlotte. A name she had never heard. Yet something about it settled strangely inside her chest. As though a missing piece had quietly found its place. Theodore's gaze shifted toward her immediately. Watching. Measuring. Making certain she remained steady. Nathaniel noticed that too. Of course he noticed. The entire room noticed. The lawyer cleared his throat softly and stepped forward. "Perhaps introductions would be easier once we address the legal matter." Theodore did not look away from Nathaniel. "Later." The older man wisely fell silent. Nathaniel studied Theodore for several seconds before speaking again. "You still do not trust me." Theodore's answer arrived without hesitation. "No." Nathaniel almost smiled. Not amusement. Recognition. "Fair enough." Lillian looked between them. The tension felt older than the conversation itself. Older than her arrival at Blackmere Hall. "You know each other." Nathaniel's expression shifted. Theodore's did not. "Our families knew each other." Nathaniel answered carefully. Theodore finally spoke. "Before the fire." Silence followed. Lillian felt another question forming immediately. Too many questions. Always too many questions. Then why would Abigail Wright trust no Ashcroft? Nathaniel's composure cracked for the first time. Not dramatically, but enough. The answer clearly mattered. Theodore noticed. So did Lillian. Nathaniel looked toward the windows overlooking the grounds. "Because Abigail never trusted my father." The room became very still. Theodore folded his arms. "And should she have?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened faintly. "No." Lillian stared at him. The honesty startled her. Most people defended family automatically. Nathaniel Ashcroft had not even attempted it. Theodore seemed equally surprised, though only someone who knew him well would have noticed. Nathaniel continued quietly. "My father believed Housevale made dangerous enemies." Lillian frowned slightly. "That explains nothing." "No." His voice lowered. "It does not." Sunlight shifted across the floorboards while silence stretched between them. Finally Nathaniel crossed toward one of the chairs near the fireplace. Not sitting. Simply resting one hand against its carved wooden back. 20 years ago there were rumors. Theodore's expression turned colder. Rumors. About land contracts. Nathaniel glanced briefly toward the lawyer. About inheritance disputes. "And?" Theodore asked. Nathaniel looked toward Lillian again. "And about someone attempting to gain control of Housevale through legal manipulation." The lawyer inhaled sharply. The sound immediately captured everyone's attention. Theodore's eyes narrowed. "You know something." The older man looked suddenly uncomfortable. "Your Grace." "Answer the question." The lawyer hesitated, then slowly removed a leather folder from his briefcase. Lillian felt unease tighten inside her chest. Every important conversation seemed to involve old documents, old signatures, old secrets. The lawyer opened the folder and removed a single sheet, yellowed with age. Official. He handed it toward Theodore. "I intended to discuss this later." Theodore accepted the page. His expression remained unreadable while reading. Then something dangerous settled behind his eyes. Not anger exactly. Something colder. More precise. "This was filed 6 months before the fire." The lawyer nodded once. Theodore looked toward Lillian. Someone petitioned the court to challenge your mother's inheritance rights. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Lillian stared at him. Why? Nathaniel answered before Theodore could. Because if Charlotte lost control of House Vale assets, someone else would gain them. The answer landed heavily. Lillian looked toward the document in Theodore's hands. Another invisible thread connecting itself to the larger picture. Theodore turned several pages, then stopped. His attention sharpened instantly. Interesting. Nathaniel watched him carefully. What? Theodore looked up slowly. The petition was filed by an attorney representing a client. The lawyer's face lost what little color remained. Nathaniel frowned. Who? Theodore read the name. Silence followed immediately, the kind of silence that changes a room. Lillian saw Nathaniel go completely still. The lawyer looked away. Theodore lowered the paper. Edgar Vailcrest. Her breath caught softly. For a moment she thought she misheard. Edgar Vailcrest. The man who raised her. The man who accepted money to hide her identity. The man who sold her publicly for amusement. Theodore's expression remained perfectly calm, which somehow made everything worse. Nathaniel stared at the document in disbelief. That is impossible. Theodore handed him the page. Read it yourself. Nathaniel accepted it quickly. His eyes moved across the text. Once, then again. Slower. The room remained silent except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere beyond the walls. Finally Nathaniel lowered the paper. My God! Lillian looked toward him. You did not know. It was not a question. Nathaniel shook his head. No. Theodore's gaze remained fixed on him, watching for deception, searching for it, finding none. Nathaniel looked genuinely shaken. Edgar Vailcrest had no connection to House Vale before the fire. Theodore nodded once. Which raises an interesting question. Lillian already knew the question before he asked it. Who gave him one? No one answered immediately, because no one knew. The realization settled heavily across the room. Edgar Vailcrest was no longer merely the man who raised her. He had become something else entirely. Participant. A player inside events that began long before she arrived in his household. Nathaniel slowly folded the document. If Edgar filed this petition 6 months before the fire, his voice trailed off. Theodore finished the thought. Then someone knew about Eleanor before she disappeared. The room fell silent again. Lillian felt cold spread through her chest. Because for the first time, the timeline no longer fit the story she had been told. If Edgar was involved before the fire, then he had not simply accepted a child from a stranger afterward. He had already been connected to whatever happened. Theodore seemed to reach the same conclusion. His eyes turned glacial. He lied. Nathaniel nodded faintly. Yes. Lillian moved slowly toward the nearest chair and lowered herself into it. Her thoughts raced faster than she could organize them. Every revelation reshaped the past. Every answer destroyed another assumption. Theodore crossed toward her immediately, not speaking, just remaining nearby. The gesture steadied her more than words could have. Nathaniel watched the interaction quietly. Something unreadable moved across his expression. Not jealousy, not discomfort, recognition perhaps, as though he understood something important about Theodore without needing it explained. The lawyer finally cleared his throat. There is one more matter. Nobody liked the sound of that. Theodore looked toward him. Continue. The older man removed another document from his briefcase. This one newer, cleaner, recent. When we reopened the trust review after Miss Vale's identification, he paused. A request for access had already been submitted. Theodore's expression hardened instantly. By whom? The lawyer swallowed carefully. An anonymous representative. Nathaniel frowned. When? 3 weeks ago. Silence crashed through the room. 3 weeks. Before the ballroom. Before Blackmere. Before her identity became public. Theodore's gaze sharpened dangerously. Someone knew she was alive. The lawyer nodded. Apparently. Lillian felt her pulse begin hammering again. 3 weeks ago. Someone had already been searching. Someone had already known enough to look. Nathaniel looked toward Theodore slowly. Then whoever started this never stopped. Theodore did not answer. He did not need to. The truth already hung between them. 20 years had passed. The fire was old. The inheritance was hidden. The names had changed. Yet somewhere beyond Blackmere Hall, someone was still watching the same story unfold. And now they knew Eleanor Vale had finally come home. The realization lingered long after the meeting ended. Someone had searched for Eleanor Vale 3 weeks before Theodore brought her to Blackmere Hall. Someone had known enough to look inside trust records that should have remained forgotten. By evening, a heavy stillness settled across the estate. The lawyer had retired to guest quarters. Nathaniel Ashcroft remained under Blackmere's hospitality, though hospitality felt like an imperfect description. Theodore had not ordered guards around him. He had not needed to. Blackmere Hall itself felt impossible to leave unnoticed. Lillian stood alone on the eastern terrace shortly before sunset, watching golden light spill across the lake below the cliffs. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant rain. For the first time all day, silence surrounded her. No documents, no revelations, no hidden names emerging from the past. Yet somehow her thoughts felt louder than ever. Charlotte Vale, Abigail Hartwell, Edgar Valecrest, Nathaniel Ashcroft. The names circled endlessly through her mind, pieces of a story she still could not fully see. Footsteps approached behind her. She recognized them before turning. Theodore. He moved quietly for a man whose presence filled every room he entered. She remained facing the lake. "How long have you been standing there?" Theodore stopped beside the stone railing. "Long enough to know you have not moved." A faint smile touched her lips despite everything. "You make that sound concerning." "It is." The answer came immediately. Lillian glanced toward him. The evening light softened the severity of his features. Exhaustion remained visible around his eyes. Yet his attention settled on her with the same unwavering focus she had come to expect. "You should rest." Theodore looked toward the lake. "You should eat." She almost laughed. "Mrs. Norwood already gave me the same lecture." "Then perhaps you should listen." Silence settled comfortably between them. The sun drifted lower beyond the mountains. For several moments neither spoke. Then Lillian asked the question that had been waiting all afternoon. "Why did you never tell me about Charlotte?" Theodore's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Because I did not know enough." "You knew her?" "Yes." His answer came quietly, certain. Lillian turned fully toward him. "Tell me about her." Something changed in Theodore's expression. Not resistance. Something closer to memory. He remained silent for several seconds before speaking. "She was kind." The simplicity of the answer surprised her. Theodore noticed. "Everyone remembers beauty first." His voice lowered slightly. "They remembered kindness second." Which was a mistake. Lillian listened carefully. Theodore rarely volunteered personal memories. Every word mattered. "What was she like?" Theodore leaned one hand against the stone railing. The setting sun reflected across the lake below them. She noticed people others overlooked. Lillian felt something tighten softly inside her chest. Theodore continued. "Servants. Stable boys. Guests standing alone at parties. Children no one paid attention to." His eyes lowered briefly. "Me." The answer startled her. Theodore Ravenshade did not seem like someone easily overlooked. Yet she remembered. 20 years ago he had been a boy. Not a duke. Not the powerful man standing beside her now. Just a boy. Theodore's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "My father died when I was young." Lillian said nothing. Theodore rarely spoke about family. "Most people treated me carefully afterward." He looked toward the mountains. Charlotte did not. "Why?" "Because she thought pity was insulting." A small laugh escaped Lillian before she could stop it. Theodore's mouth almost curved in response. "Almost. That sounds familiar." "It should." His eyes met hers briefly. "You inherited it." Warmth moved unexpectedly through her chest. Not because of the compliment. Because of the certainty behind it. Theodore was not flattering her. He was observing her. The way he always did. The way he had for years. The realization lingered between them. Neither acknowledged it aloud. The moment stretched gently before Lillian finally asked another question. "And my father?" Theodore's expression changed instantly. The warmth vanished. Not completely. But enough. Which one? The answer landed harder than intended. Both of them knew it. Lillian lowered her gaze. The man who raised me. Theodore looked back toward the lake. Edgar was never part of House Vale. Then how did he become involved? Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. That is the question I have been asking for 20 years. The honesty surprised her. Theodore rarely admitted uncertainty. She studied him carefully. You really do not know. No. He exhaled slowly. I know he lied. I know he appeared before the fire. I know someone connected him to your family. His eyes darkened. I do not yet know why. Silence followed. The last rays of sunlight painted the water below in gold and amber. Somewhere distant, a hawk circled above the trees. Lillian rested both hands against the cool stone railing. You searched for me all that time. Theodore did not answer immediately. She continued anyway. Everyone keeps saying 20 years as though it explains everything. His attention shifted toward her. It explains very little. The answer surprised her. Theodore looked away first, toward the fading horizon. People hear 20 years and imagine devotion. His voice had grown quieter now, more personal. They imagine certainty. Lillian waited. Theodore's gaze remained fixed somewhere far beyond the lake. Somewhere in the past. Most years were neither. The words settled softly between them. Then what were they? For several moments he did not answer. The wind moved through the pines below. Evening shadows lengthened across the estate. Finally Theodore spoke. Failure. Lillian stared at him. Theodore Ravenshade. The man who never appeared uncertain. Never appeared weak. Yet there was no hesitation in his voice. Every year that passed meant I had not found you. His expression remained calm, yet something raw lived beneath it. Every birthday I imagined you somewhere else. Lillian felt her throat tighten. Theodore continued before she could respond. Every lead that disappeared. Every witness who remembered nothing. Every record that ended at a dead end. He looked toward the darkening water. I told myself I was searching for answers. Pause followed. Long, heavy. But after enough years, I was searching for proof that you survived. The confession settled through her with startling force. More powerful than grand declarations ever could have been. Because it sounded true. Painfully true. Lillian lowered her eyes. Suddenly breathing felt difficult. Theodore had carried that burden alone. Year after year. While she remained unaware he even existed. Why? The question escaped softly. Theodore turned toward her. What? Why keep going? Her voice trembled slightly despite her efforts. Most people would have stopped. Theodore stared at her for several seconds. The fading sunlight illuminated one side of his face while shadows touched the other. For the first time since she met him, he looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. The exhaustion of someone who had carried the same promise for too long. Because I was the last person who saw you. Silence crashed between them. Lillian's pulse stumbled. Theodore looked away, as though the admission itself cost him something. The night of the fire. His voice lowered. You were crying. She remained completely still. Theodore continued. Everyone was distracted. There were guests everywhere. Confusion. Noise. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon. You wandered away from the ballroom. Lillian's heart hammered painfully now. Theodore swallowed once. The movement was subtle, yet she noticed. I found you in the West Garden. The world seemed to narrow around his words. Theodore was no longer standing beside her. Not entirely. Part of him remained somewhere 20 years in the past. You were sitting beside the fountain. His expression softened. Just slightly. You were angry because someone took your ribbon. A breath caught in Lillian's throat. Theodore looked down briefly. You told me it was unfair. A faint shadow of something almost resembling a smile touched his face. Then you demanded I help you find it. Lillian could not speak. Theodore's gaze lifted toward the darkening sky. I promised I would. Silence followed. Deep silence. The kind that changes people. Lillian finally understood. Not completely. Perhaps she never would. But enough. Theodore had not spent 20 years searching because of duty. Not because of obligation. Not because of inheritance. He searched because he made a promise to a little girl beside a fountain. And when she disappeared, he never forgave himself. The realization nearly broke her heart. Theodore seemed to recognize the direction of her thoughts immediately. He straightened slightly. The vulnerability vanished behind control. Not completely, but enough. You should go inside. His voice returned to its usual calmness. Lillian stared at him. That is how you end this conversation? Something unexpected flickered near his eyes. Dry amusement. Brief. Genuine. I am attempting to. She shook her head softly. Theodore looked almost relieved by the reaction. Almost. Then footsteps echoed across the terrace behind them. Fast. Urgent. Both turned immediately. Mrs. Norwood approached with unusual speed. Concern was visible across her face before she spoke a single word. Theodore's expression hardened at once. What happened? Mrs. Norwood stopped several feet away. A telegram arrived from Charleston. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Theodore crossed toward her. From whom? Mrs. Norwood handed him the folded message. The investigator. Theodore read it once. Then again. Slower. The silence stretched. Lillian watched carefully. The color left his face. Not much. Just enough. Fear moved coldly through her chest. Real fear. Theodore rarely reacted visibly to anything. Theodore. His eyes lifted toward hers. Something dangerous settled behind them. Something very old. The witness is gone. The evening seemed to stop around them. Gone. Theodore folded the telegram carefully. Too carefully. The records clerk left Charleston yesterday. Mrs. Norwood swallowed. No forwarding address. Silence followed. Heavy. Unforgiving. Theodore looked toward the mountains beyond the lake. His expression became unreadable once more. Yet Lillian knew him better now than she had a week ago. Better than she wanted to admit. And she recognized exactly what she saw. Someone had reached the witness before they could. Someone was already moving ahead of them. And for the first time, Theodore Ravenshade looked as though he feared they were running out of time. The decision to leave for Charleston moved from possibility to necessity before sunrise. Blackmere Hall awakened earlier than usual the following morning. Servants crossed the estate with quiet efficiency. Carriages were prepared. Travel trunks appeared in hallways. Messages arrived and departed through the front gates with unusual frequency. Yet beneath the activity lived something else. Tension. The missing witness had changed everything. Someone knew where the investigation was leading. Someone was moving pieces before Theodore could reach them. Lillian stood in the East Wing dressing room fastening the final buttons of her traveling coat when a sharp knock sounded against the door. Come in. A maid entered carrying a folded note. This was delivered for you, miss. Lillian frowned slightly. For me? The maid nodded. It arrived with the Morning Post. Unease stirred immediately. Very few people knew she was at Blackmere Hall. Even fewer knew enough to write directly to her. She accepted the note. The envelope carried no name, no seal, nothing. The maid withdrew quietly. Lillian waited until the door closed before unfolding the paper. Only a single sentence appeared inside. Do not go to Charleston. Her pulse stopped for one terrible second, then accelerated violently. She read the sentence again. The handwriting revealed nothing. No signature, no clue, just the warning. A cold sensation moved through her chest. Not panic. Something sharper, purposeful. Someone knew about the trip. Someone wanted it stopped. The realization followed immediately afterward. Theodore needed to see this. Less than 5 minutes later, she entered the library. Theodore stood beside the desk reviewing maps spread across the polished wood surface. Nathaniel Ashcroft occupied a chair near the fireplace. The lawyer from Boston had already departed earlier that morning to make separate arrangements in Charleston. Theodore looked up the moment she entered. His attention immediately sharpened. What happened? Lillian handed him the note without speaking. Theodore accepted it. The room fell silent while his eyes moved across the sentence. Once, then again. More slowly. Nathaniel rose from his chair. What is it? Theodore handed him the paper. Nathaniel read it. His expression darkened instantly. When did this arrive? A few minutes ago. Theodore crossed toward the windows overlooking the lake. The note remained in his hand. His face revealed almost nothing. Yet Lillian recognized the signs now. The dangerous stillness. The precise control. Theodore Ravenshade was angry. Nathaniel folded his arms. Someone knows our plans. Theodore nodded once. Yes. Silence followed. Heavy silence. Nathaniel looked toward Lillian. Has anyone outside this house been informed? Only the investigator in Charleston. Theodore's voice remained calm. Too calm. And several members of my staff. Nathaniel frowned slightly. You trust them. Theodore's eyes turned glacial. Completely. Nathaniel wisely said nothing further. Lillian looked between them. A troubling thought had already begun forming. Theodore noticed immediately. What are you thinking? She hesitated. Then answered honestly. Someone inside Blackmere may have spoken without realizing the importance. Nathaniel looked toward her. Theodore remained silent. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Theodore crossed back toward the desk. Perhaps. The answer sounded unconvinced. Lillian knew why. Blackmere Hall operated with extraordinary loyalty. She had witnessed it herself. The servants respected Theodore not from fear. From devotion. The estate felt less like employment and more like family. Yet facts remained facts. The warning existed. Someone knew. Theodore folded the note carefully and placed it beside the investigation file. We leave in 1 hour. Nathaniel blinked once. After this. Theodore looked toward him. Especially after this. The certainty in his voice settled the matter instantly. Whoever sent the message had intended to stop them. Theodore had just decided to move faster instead. The journey began beneath clear skies shortly after 9 o'clock. For the first time in days, sunlight broke fully across the mountains surrounding Blackmere Hall. The lake shimmered below the cliffs while carriage wheels rolled across the long stone drive leading away from the estate. Lillian sat beside Theodore inside the main carriage. Nathaniel traveled behind them with 2 guards. Mrs. Norwood remained at Blackmere to oversee the household. The atmosphere inside the carriage remained quiet during the first hour. Theodore reviewed documents. Lillian watched forests pass beyond the windows. Yet her thoughts kept returning to the note. Do not go to Charleston. Not a threat. Not an explanation. A warning. Which somehow felt worse. Theodore finally lowered the papers in his hands. You have read that sentence at least 50 times in your head. Lillian blinked. How would you know that? A faint shadow of amusement touched his eyes. Because you keep staring at the same tree line without seeing it. Despite everything, a small smile appeared. Theodore noticed. Of course he noticed. The smile faded quickly. The questions remained. What if they are trying to help us? Theodore looked toward her. The note. She nodded. What if someone wants us to avoid danger? Theodore considered that possibility for several moments, then slowly shook his head. People trying to help usually provide reasons. Lillian could not argue with that. Silence returned. The carriage continued south through pine forests and rolling hills. Around noon they stopped briefly at a roadside inn to water the horses. Theodore insisted she eat lunch despite her lack of appetite. The pattern felt increasingly familiar. Whenever danger appeared, Theodore became more attentive rather than less. More protective. More observant. As though every threat reinforced an old promise made beside a fountain 20 years earlier. They resumed traveling shortly afterward. The first sign that something was wrong appeared less than an hour later. Not dramatic. Not obvious. A subtle jolt beneath the carriage floor. Lillian felt it immediately. Theodore did too. His attention lifted toward the ceiling. The carriage rocked once. Then again. Slightly harder. Outside, one of the drivers shouted something. The horses slowed. Theodore's expression changed instantly. Every trace of calm conversation vanished. Stay inside. The words landed with quiet authority. Before Lillian could respond, he opened the carriage door and stepped down onto the road. Sunlight flooded the interior briefly before the door closed behind him. Lillian remained motionless, listening. Voices carried through the walls of the carriage. Horses, drivers, guards, then silence. Several minutes passed, longer than they should have. Finally the door opened again. Theodore returned. Dust marked one sleeve of his coat. His expression had become unreadable. What happened? Theodore closed the door behind him. A wheel pin was removed. The world seemed to narrow around the answer. Lillian stared at him. Removed? Theodore nodded once. Deliberately. Cold moved through her chest. Someone tampered with the carriage. Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. Yes. Silence followed immediately. The significance required no explanation. If the carriage had continued farther before stopping, the wheel could have failed on mountain roads ahead. Theodore seemed to read the direction of her thoughts instantly. The drivers noticed in time. His voice remained controlled, yet anger moved beneath every word. Lillian lowered her eyes. Someone knew the route. Someone knew the timing. Someone acted before they even reached Charleston. Theodore looked toward the windows. The forests outside seemed suddenly less peaceful. Nathaniel appeared beside the carriage moments later. Theodore opened the door before he could knock. Nathaniel stepped inside. The guards checked everything. His expression was grim. No sign of who did it. Theodore nodded once. As expected. Nathaniel sat across from them. Silence lingered for several seconds. Then he spoke quietly. This happened too quickly. Theodore's eyes lifted toward him. Nathaniel continued. The note. The witness disappearing. Now this. Nobody argued. Because he was right. Events were accelerating. Someone had stopped reacting and started acting. Lillian folded her hands tightly together. A troubling realization surfaced. They are not afraid of being discovered. Theodore's gaze shifted toward her immediately. She continued. If they were, they would hide. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Understanding appeared across his face. Theodore remained silent, which was answer enough. Whoever stood behind the missing records and hidden inheritance had become confident. Dangerous confidence. The kind built over years, perhaps decades. The carriage resumed traveling after repairs were completed. Yet the atmosphere had changed. Even sunlight felt different now. Sharper. Less comforting. Theodore spent most of the afternoon studying maps while occasionally glancing toward the road beyond the windows. Nathaniel reviewed legal records. Lillian watched the forests roll past. Somewhere ahead waited Charleston. Answers. Witnesses. Perhaps even Abigail Hartwell. Yet another thought refused to leave her mind. Someone had tampered with the carriage. Not at random. Not by chance. Specifically this carriage. Specifically this journey. Which meant one thing. Someone was watching them far more closely than anyone realized. The sun had begun lowering toward the horizon when Theodore suddenly straightened. His attention fixed on something beyond the window. Lillian followed his gaze. A rider appeared in the distance behind them. Then another. Then a third. Far enough away to avoid suspicion. Close enough to remain visible. Nathaniel saw them too. The silence inside the carriage deepened. Theodore watched the riders for several seconds, then reached calmly toward the roof and pulled the communication strap. Somewhere ahead, the driver responded immediately. The carriage increased speed. Theodore never looked away from the distant figures. They have been behind us for nearly 2 miles. Lillian felt her pulse begin hammering again. Who are they? Theodore's expression became terrifyingly calm. That, he said quietly, is exactly what I intend to find out. The 3 riders remained visible until sunset painted the western sky in deep shades of gold and copper. They never approached, never signaled, never attempted conversation. Yet they never disappeared either. Every time Lillian glanced through the carriage window, they remained somewhere in the distance, following the same road toward Charleston. The effect was unsettling precisely because it felt deliberate. Theodore watched them intermittently throughout the afternoon. Nathaniel did the same. Neither man appeared surprised anymore. Concerned, certainly, but not surprised. As though both had already accepted that unseen eyes were tracking every step of the investigation. The road eventually curved south through rolling farmland dotted with old oak trees and weathered stone fences. Shadows lengthened across open fields. Travelers became less frequent. By early evening, Theodore ordered an overnight stop at a private inn he owned several miles outside Charleston. The decision came without discussion. Lillian suspected he had planned it long before they left Blackmere Hall. Theodore rarely traveled without preparation. The inn stood atop a low hill overlooking a narrow river. Unlike the crowded establishments lining the main road, this one felt secluded, secure. A place chosen by a man who trusted very few things to chance. As the carriage rolled into the courtyard, lanterns glowed warmly beneath covered porches. Stable hands emerged immediately. Theodore stepped down first before offering his hand toward Lillian. The gesture had become familiar during the journey. Yet every time it happened, she noticed the same thing. He never assumed she needed help. He simply made certain it was available. Lillian accepted his hand and descended carefully. Nathaniel joined them moments later. The three distant riders never entered the courtyard. Theodore noticed immediately. So did Nathaniel. The riders continued down the main road without stopping, vanishing gradually into the evening shadows. Interesting. Nathaniel folded his arms. Theodore's gaze remained fixed on the road long after the figures disappeared. Not particularly. Nathaniel glanced toward him. You expected that. Theodore finally turned away from the road. If they wanted us harmed, there were easier opportunities. A chill moved through Lillian despite the warm evening air. Nathaniel seemed to reach the same conclusion. Then they wanted information. Theodore nodded once. Most likely. Silence followed. The implication required no explanation. Someone was watching, measuring, reporting. The question remained who. An hour later they gathered inside a private dining room overlooking the river. A fire burned in the hearth. Candlelight reflected across polished wood paneling. The atmosphere should have felt comfortable. Instead, tension lingered beneath every conversation. Theodore sat at the head of the table reviewing correspondence delivered during their journey. Nathaniel occupied the seat opposite him. Lillian sat between them, though she occasionally wondered if she functioned less as a guest and more as the center of a complicated investigation neither man fully understood. Dinner progressed quietly at first. Then Nathaniel lowered his fork and looked directly toward Theodore. We need to discuss Blackmere. Theodore's attention lifted immediately. What about it? Nathaniel hesitated briefly. The pause alone was enough to draw concern. There is a possibility we have been looking in the wrong direction. Silence settled over the table. Theodore's expression remained unreadable. Explain. Nathaniel leaned back slightly. We keep assuming the problem exists outside your estate. Lillian felt unease stir instantly. Theodore's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Continue. Nathaniel folded his hands. The warning note arrived inside Blackmere. Yes. The carriage was tampered with before departure. Yes. Theodore's voice had become noticeably colder. Nathaniel did not retreat. Someone knew about Charleston before we left. The room fell silent. Lillian understood immediately where the conversation was heading. Theodore understood too. The difference was that Theodore clearly disliked it. Nathaniel met his gaze steadily. What if the information is coming from inside Blackmere Hall? The words settled heavily across the room. Theodore's expression hardened at once. Not dramatically, like stone becoming granite. No. Nathaniel remained calm. You cannot know that. I do. The answer arrived without hesitation. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. You trust your people. Theodore's eyes turned glacial. Completely. Silence followed. The tension between them felt older than the current discussion. Older even than the investigation. Lillian watched carefully. Nathaniel seemed to choose his next words with unusual caution. Trust is not evidence. Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. And suspicion is not proof. Neither man looked away. The fire crackled softly in the background. Outside, river water moved quietly beneath moonlight. Lillian understood both perspectives. Theodore had built Blackmere into something rare. Loyalty existed there. Genuine loyalty. Yet facts remained difficult to ignore. Information kept escaping. Someone kept learning things they should not know. Nathaniel finally broke eye contact first. I am not accusing anyone. Theodore remained silent. Nathaniel continued. I am suggesting possibilities. For several moments nobody spoke. Then unexpectedly, Lillian set down her glass. Both men looked toward her. What if you are both right? Nathaniel blinked once. Theodore's attention sharpened immediately. Lillian folded her hands together. What if the leak is not intentional? Silence followed. She continued before either could respond. People talk. Nathaniel considered that. Theodore remained still. Servants hear conversations. Drivers hear instructions. Stable hands hear destinations. Lillian looked between them. One careless comment becomes information. Theodore's expression shifted slightly. Not agreement exactly. Consideration. Nathaniel nodded slowly. That is possible. Theodore leaned back in his chair. The dangerous tension near his eyes eased marginally. More possible than deliberate betrayal. Nathaniel accepted the compromise with surprising grace. Agreed. The atmosphere relaxed slightly. Not completely, but enough for conversation to continue. Yet something about the exchange remained with Lillian afterward, particularly Theodore's reaction. His defense of Blackmere had not been political. It had been personal, deeply personal, as though questioning the estate meant questioning something he considered family. The realization lingered long after dinner ended. Later that evening, Lillian stood alone beside the riverbank behind the inn. Moonlight reflected across moving water. The journey would continue at first light. Charleston waited less than a day away now. Answers waited there too, or so she hoped. Footsteps approached behind her. She already knew who it would be. Theodore stopped beside her. Neither spoke immediately. The river flowed quietly past them. Fireflies drifted through the darkness above the grass. Finally Theodore broke the silence. Nathaniel was wrong. Lillian smiled faintly. About which part? A shadow of amusement touched his expression. Brief but genuine. The betrayal theory. She looked toward the water. You care about Blackmere? Theodore's gaze followed the river downstream. Yes. The simple answer carried more weight than expected. Lillian studied him carefully. Why? Theodore remained silent for several moments, then spoke quietly. Because people stayed. She frowned slightly. Theodore continued. When my father died, many left. His voice remained calm, controlled, yet memory lived beneath every word. Employees, associates, friends. He looked toward the dark water. People who found better opportunities elsewhere. Lillian listened carefully. Theodore rarely volunteered pieces of his past. The ones who remained helped raise Blackmere with me. Understanding settled softly between them. Theodore was not protecting employees. He was protecting people who helped build his life. People who stood beside him when he had little reason to expect loyalty. The realization made perfect sense. You trust them because they earned it. Theodore nodded once. Yes. Silence followed. Comfortable silence. The kind that had become increasingly common between them. Lillian found herself appreciating those moments more than she expected. Theodore rarely filled silence unnecessarily. He allowed space for thoughts, for reflection, for breathing. Eventually he looked toward her. You handled tonight well. The compliment caught her off guard. The dinner. The argument. A faint smile appeared. You make it sound dramatic. Theodore's eyes warmed slightly. It was. Lillian laughed softly. The sound seemed strangely bright against the quiet river. Theodore watched her for a moment longer than necessary. Neither appeared to notice. Or perhaps both noticed and chose not to acknowledge it. The moment lingered gently between them. Then hurried footsteps shattered the calm. Theodore turned instantly. His expression transformed in a heartbeat. Relaxation vanished. Alertness replaced it. A young stable hand approached at nearly a run. Breathless. Pale. Your Grace. Theodore moved forward immediately. What happened? The stable hand stopped several feet away. One of the drivers found something. Theodore's attention sharpened. Where? On the carriage. Silence followed. Cold silence. Theodore exchanged a glance with Lillian before turning back toward the boy. Show me. Minutes later they stood beneath lantern light inside the stable yard. Horses shifted quietly in nearby stalls. Night air carried the scent of hay and river water. Several stable hands waited beside the carriage. Theodore approached first. The others stepped aside immediately. Lillian followed close behind. Nathaniel appeared moments later from the inn. One of the drivers pointed toward the rear panel of the carriage. It was not there earlier. Theodore crouched slightly, his gaze fixed on something carved into the wood. Not damage, not a threat. A symbol. Small, precise, deliberate. Lillian stepped closer. Her pulse accelerated instantly. She recognized it. So did Nathaniel. A silver lily, the exact same flower engraved on Abigail Hartwell's brooch. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Theodore remained completely still, then slowly reached out and traced the carving with one fingertip. His expression became impossible to read. Nathaniel looked toward him. Someone left us a message. Theodore straightened. Moonlight touched the sharp lines of his face. Yes. His voice had gone very quiet, very controlled, which meant he was more disturbed than he appeared. Lillian stared at the carved lily. A warning, a clue, or an invitation. She no longer knew. Theodore's eyes remained fixed on the symbol. Then he spoke words that made the night suddenly feel much colder. No. Nathaniel frowned. What? Theodore looked toward the road stretching south toward Charleston. Not someone. Silence followed. Then Theodore's gaze returned to the lily. Abigail. And for the first time in 20 years, he sounded as though he believed the woman who vanished with Eleanor Vale might still be alive. Sleep became impossible after the discovery in the stable yard. Long after midnight, the carved lily remained fixed in Lillian's mind. She saw it when she closed her eyes. She saw it reflected in Theodore's expression when he spoke Abigail Hartwell's name. Not hope, not certainty, recognition, as though dozens of disconnected clues had suddenly begun aligning into a pattern only he could see. By dawn, the inn had awakened under a blanket of low gray clouds. The river moved quietly beyond the hill while preparations for departure resumed. Yet the atmosphere had changed. The mystery was no longer abstract. Someone had touched their carriage. Someone had left a symbol known only to a handful of people connected to Eleanor Vale's disappearance. And according to Theodore, that someone might be Abigail herself. Lillian found him in the private study shortly after sunrise. He stood before a large map spread across a table. Several locations had been marked in pencil during the night. Nathaniel sat nearby reviewing a collection of old legal records. Neither man looked rested. Theodore glanced up the moment she entered. You should have slept longer. Lillian crossed toward the table. You did not. A faint shadow of amusement touched his eyes. That is different. Only because you decided it is. Nathaniel surprised them both by laughing softly. Theodore looked unimpressed. Nathaniel appeared entirely unconcerned. For the first time since arriving at Blackmere, Lillian noticed something unexpected. The two men were beginning to trust each other. Not completely, not even close. Yet the hostility had softened into reluctant cooperation. Theodore turned his attention back toward the map. We leave in 20 minutes. Lillian studied the markings. These are Charleston districts. Theodore nodded. Places connected to Abigail. Her pulse quickened immediately. You found records? A few. Nathaniel rose from his chair and approached the table. Not enough to prove anything. Theodore's expression remained focused. Enough to follow. The journey resumed beneath overcast skies. Charleston appeared shortly after noon. The city stretched along the harbor in a mixture of elegance and age. Church spires rose above tree-lined streets. Historic buildings stood beside newer developments. Carriages crowded intersections. Ships rested beyond the waterfront with masts piercing the gray horizon. As they entered the city, Lillian felt something strange settle inside her chest. She had lived here most of her life, yet now it felt unfamiliar. Not because the streets had changed, because she had. Theodore seemed to sense her unease immediately. Are you all right? She looked out the window toward passing buildings. I am not sure. His gaze remained on her for a moment before returning to the city beyond. That is understandable. The answer carried no judgment, only patience. The carriage stopped first at a modest office near the historic district. The investigator who had been assisting Theodore for several years waited inside. His name was Samuel Whitaker. He appeared to be in his 60s with thoughtful eyes and a manner that suggested he preferred facts over speculation. Theodore greeted him briefly before getting straight to business. Tell me about the witness. Whitaker's expression darkened. She disappeared 48 hours before your telegram arrived. Theodore remained silent. Whitaker continued. Neighbors claim she packed quickly and left with very little notice. Nathaniel folded his arms. Did anyone see where she went? No. Whitaker hesitated. But she left something behind. Every person in the room became still. Theodore's attention sharpened immediately. What? Whitaker reached into a desk drawer and removed a folded piece of paper. She gave this to a neighbor the morning she left. Theodore accepted it. The room fell silent while he read. Then his expression changed. Lillian recognized the look instantly. Surprise. Genuine surprise. What is it? Theodore handed her the note. Her pulse accelerated the moment she saw the handwriting. It matched the hidden letter discovered inside Blackmere Hall. Abigail Hartwell. The message was short. If Eleanor returns, tell her I never abandoned her. Lillian stared at the words. The room seemed to disappear around her. 20 years. 20 years of questions. 20 years believing the woman vanished without explanation. And now this, a message waiting specifically for her. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. Theodore watched her carefully but said nothing. The silence itself felt protective, giving her space to absorb what the note meant. Nathaniel finally spoke. That confirms she is alive. Whitaker nodded. Most likely. Theodore's gaze remained fixed on the paper. And nearby, everyone looked toward him. Theodore placed the note beside the map. She knew Eleanor had returned before the news became public. Nathaniel frowned. Which means she is watching events closely. Theodore nodded once. Very closely. The realization settled heavily across the room. Abigail was not lost. She was informed, active, deliberate, someone who had remained hidden by choice. Whitaker cleared his throat. There is more. Theodore looked up. Whitaker opened a folder and removed another document. While searching hospital records, I found references to a private trust established 1 month after the fire. Nathaniel accepted the document first. His eyes moved across the page. Then he froze. This cannot be right. Theodore took the paper. Lillian watched both men carefully. Whatever they were reading had shaken them. Theodore's jaw tightened. Who filed this? Whitaker answered immediately. The records list an intermediary. Name. Whitaker looked down at the document. Charlotte Vale. Silence filled the room. Complete silence. Lillian stared at him. My mother. Whitaker nodded. According to the filing. Confusion crashed through her instantly. That makes no sense. Theodore's expression had become unreadable. Dangerous. Focused. No. His voice lowered. It does not. Nathaniel looked between them. Charlotte died in the fire. Theodore's eyes remained fixed on the document. Exactly. The implications settled slowly. If Charlotte filed paperwork 1 month after the fire, then one of two things had happened. Either the records were forged, or someone wanted the world to believe Charlotte Vale survived longer than anyone realized. Whitaker spread additional papers across the desk. The trust transferred money every year for 2 decades. Lillian felt her pulse quicken. To whom? Whitaker looked toward her. An anonymous recipient. Nathaniel exhaled sharply. Theodore remained perfectly still. Not anonymous. Everyone looked toward him. Theodore tapped the note from Abigail. Once. Protected. The room fell silent again. The theory formed instantly. House Vale money. Hidden trust. Abigail Hartwell. A missing child. 20 years of secrecy. Lillian slowly sat down. The scale of it felt overwhelming. Abigail had not simply rescued her. She had spent 20 years making certain she survived. Theodore seemed to reach the same conclusion. Something softened briefly behind his eyes. Respect. Gratitude. Perhaps both. Then another thought appeared. Colder. More troubling. Nathaniel voiced it first. If Abigail controlled the trust, someone else may have known. Theodore nodded. Yes. Whitaker looked uncomfortable. There is one final problem. Nobody liked the sound of that. Theodore's attention shifted toward him. What problem? Whitaker hesitated, then removed a final document from the folder. The trust account was accessed last month. Silence followed immediately. Theodore's expression hardened. By whom? Whitaker lowered his gaze toward the page. The records do not say. Nathaniel stepped forward. Then what do they say? Whitaker swallowed. Only that the authorization required a blood relative of House Vale. The room seemed to stop. Lillian stared at him. Theodore did not move. Nathaniel looked genuinely stunned. A blood relative. The words echoed through every unanswered question. Finally Theodore spoke. Very quietly. Eleanor is here. Whitaker nodded. Which means someone else used the authorization. Lillian felt cold spread through her chest. Nathaniel's expression darkened. Theodore looked toward the window overlooking Charleston streets. His eyes had become distant, calculating, connecting pieces. Then suddenly he turned back toward Whitaker. How many blood relatives of House Vale survived the fire? Whitaker hesitated. The hesitation alone was enough to trigger alarm. Theodore noticed. So did everyone else. Answer the question. Whitaker lowered his voice. According to official records. Pause followed. Long enough to make Lillian's heart pound. 2. Silence crashed through the room. Theodore stared at him. Nathaniel stared at him. Lillian felt the floor vanish beneath her. 2 survivors. Not 1. 2. And somewhere in Charleston, another member of House Vale had just stepped out of the shadows. For several seconds nobody spoke. The office seemed to shrink around the revelation. 2 survivors. Not 1. 2. Outside the windows, Charleston continued its afternoon routine. Carriages rolled through crowded streets. Church bells sounded in the distance. Harbor traffic moved steadily beneath gray skies. Yet inside the room, everything had changed. Lillian sat motionless. Her pulse echoed loudly in her ears. Theodore remained standing beside the desk. Completely still. Too still. Nathaniel broke the silence first. Who was the second survivor? Whitaker lowered his eyes toward the documents spread across the table. That is where the records become complicated. Theodore's expression hardened. Complicated is not an answer. Whitaker nodded once. No. He opened another folder and removed several aging pages. Most official records list only Eleanor Vale. Lillian felt her stomach tighten. Whitaker continued. A smaller collection references another child. Theodore stepped forward immediately. Name. Whitaker hesitated. The records disagree. Silence followed. Theodore's patience was visibly thinning. Whitaker quickly continued. Some list a nephew. Others reference a cousin. One file simply identifies the child as a dependent under House Vale protection. Nathaniel frowned. How old? Whitaker looked down. Approximately 7 years old at the time of the fire. Lillian stared at him. 7. The same age she had been. Theodore's eyes narrowed. And after the fire? Whitaker slowly shook his head. Nothing. The answer settled heavily across the room. Another missing child. Another disappearance. Another piece of a puzzle that seemed determined to hide itself. Theodore reached toward the documents and examined them personally. His attention moved across every line, every notation, every signature. Lillian watched him carefully. She had learned enough by now to recognize the signs. Theodore was searching for something specific, some detail others had overlooked. Eventually his gaze stopped. His expression changed. Barely, but enough. Interesting. Nathaniel immediately stepped closer. What? Theodore tapped one corner of a document. This record was altered. Whitaker frowned. How can you tell? Theodore pointed toward the date. Different ink. The room grew quiet. Whitaker adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. After several moments he exhaled sharply. You are right. Nathaniel folded his arms. Someone changed it. Theodore nodded once. Years later, Lillian rose from her chair. What was changed? Theodore looked toward her. His eyes had grown colder, more focused. The child's surname. Silence followed. Nathaniel stared at the page. What was it originally? Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. That is the problem. He looked back toward the document. Someone removed it completely. The implications landed immediately. Another identity erased. Another life hidden. Another survivor buried beneath false records. Lillian crossed toward the window. Her thoughts felt increasingly tangled. The missing child, Abigail Hartwell, the hidden trust, the warning note. Every answer generated 3 new questions. Theodore seemed to sense her frustration immediately. His gaze softened slightly. "We will find the truth." She looked toward him. The certainty in his voice remained astonishing. Even now, even with every new complication, Theodore believed they would reach the end. Part of her wished she possessed the same confidence. Whitaker cleared his throat. "There is one more thing." Nobody looked pleased to hear those words anymore. Theodore turned toward him. "Continue." Whitaker removed a folded newspaper clipping from the folder. The paper appeared old, yellowed, fragile with age. This appeared 6 weeks after the fire. Theodore accepted it. His eyes moved quickly across the article. Then slowly, much more slowly, Nathaniel watched carefully. "What is it?" Theodore handed him the clipping. Nathaniel read it. His expression immediately darkened. Lillian felt her pulse accelerate. "What?" Nathaniel looked up. "A charity fundraiser." She blinked. "What?" Nathaniel lowered the newspaper. "According to this article, a memorial fund was established after the fire." Theodore's eyes remained fixed on the clipping. "Look at the donors." Nathaniel did. Then his expression changed instantly. "No." Lillian stepped forward. "What?" Theodore handed her the article. Her gaze moved down the page. The donor list appeared near the bottom. Several names were familiar. Charleston families, business associates, political figures. Then she saw it. Edgar Vailcrest. Her breath caught softly. Theodore's expression had become unreadable again. 2 donations. His voice remained calm. Too calm. 1 month apart. Lillian stared at the newspaper. Edgar again. Always Edgar. Appearing before he should have existed inside the story. Connected to people he should never have known. Theodore folded the clipping carefully. "He was involved long before anyone admits." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "Agreed." Silence followed. Whitaker watched them with growing concern. "There is something else you should know." Theodore looked toward him. Whitaker hesitated, then finally spoke. Edgar was not the only unexpected name. The room became still. Theodore's eyes narrowed. "Who else?" Whitaker swallowed carefully. "Abigail Hartwell." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Lillian felt her heart stop for one impossible second. Theodore's face lost what little color remained. Not dramatically, just enough. Whitaker continued quietly. "She donated anonymously." Theodore stared at him. "You are certain?" Whitaker nodded. "The records were sealed. I only found them yesterday." Silence crashed through the office. Abigail Hartwell. 6 weeks after the fire. Alive. In Charleston. Handling money connected to House Vale. Theodore looked away first. Toward the windows. Toward the city beyond. Toward somewhere only he could see. Lillian studied him carefully. Something had shifted. Deeply shifted. The discovery was not merely another clue. It meant Abigail had remained near Charleston after the fire. It meant she had not vanished immediately. It meant Theodore had searched within miles of the truth without knowing it. The realization hit him harder than anyone else. She could see it, even if he tried to hide it. Nathaniel appeared to notice as well. "Theodore." No response. Theodore remained staring toward the harbor. The silence stretched. Then suddenly he spoke. 20 years. His voice sounded distant. Not cold. Not controlled. Simply tired. "She was here." Nobody interrupted. Theodore continued. "All this time." Lillian felt her chest tighten. Theodore rarely allowed emotion to surface. Rarely allowed anyone close enough to see what lived beneath the discipline. Yet something about this discovery had broken through the walls he normally maintained. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Just enough. Enough for her to see the cost. 20 years of searching. 20 years of mischances. 20 years of believing he had failed. Theodore lowered one hand against the edge of the desk. A small gesture, yet strangely revealing. He looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. The weight of 2 decades suddenly settling onto his shoulders. Lillian crossed the room before fully realizing she had moved. She stopped beside him, close enough for him to know he was not alone. Theodore's eyes lifted toward hers. For a moment neither spoke. The room faded away. Whitaker, Nathaniel, the documents, everything. There was only the look in Theodore's eyes, the grief, the frustration, the relentless guilt he carried even now. Then something unexpected happened. Theodore laughed softly, once, without humor, without joy. The sound startled everyone, including himself. I was right. Silence followed. Nathaniel frowned. About what? Theodore looked down briefly, then back toward the window. She survived. The answer shattered something inside Lillian. Because beneath all the investigations and records and clues, the truth remained painfully simple. Theodore had spent 20 years hoping she was alive, and every year that hope hurt him. Nathaniel remained silent. Whitaker wisely did the same. Theodore finally straightened. The vulnerable moment disappeared almost immediately. The Duke returned, controlled, focused, determined, yet not before Lillian saw enough. Not before she understood. Theodore turned back toward the desk. We find Abigail. His voice had regained its certainty. Nathaniel nodded. Agreed. Whitaker reached toward another folder. Then you should see this. Theodore's attention sharpened instantly. Whitaker removed a photograph and slid it across the desk. A witness provided it this morning. Theodore picked it up first. His expression changed immediately. Then he handed it toward Lillian. Her breath caught the moment she saw it. The image showed a woman standing outside a church entrance approximately 10 years earlier. Older than the Abigail photograph Theodore kept inside the blue folder. But unmistakably the same person. Abigail Hartwell. Alive. Watching the camera with the same serious eyes. Yet that was not what stole Lillian's attention. She looked toward the young boy standing beside Abigail. Dark hair. Approximately 17 years old. Familiar features. Her pulse began hammering violently. Theodore saw it too. Nathaniel stepped closer. Who is he? Nobody answered immediately, because they all recognized him. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The boy looked remarkably like the child described in the altered records, the second survivor of House Vale. And as Theodore stared at the photograph, a terrible possibility appeared behind his eyes. If the boy in the picture was the missing heir, then someone had not hidden one survivor of the fire. Someone had hidden two. The photograph remained on the desk long after anyone stopped speaking. Afternoon light filtered through the office windows, casting pale reflections across the image. Abigail Hartwell stood beside a church entrance. The young man beside her appeared relaxed, unaware that a single photograph taken years earlier had just altered the course of an investigation that began 2 decades ago. Theodore studied the image with unwavering focus. Nathaniel remained beside him. Whitaker quietly organized documents nearby. Lillian could not stop looking at the boy. The resemblance was subtle at first, not obvious enough to attract attention from strangers. Yet once seen, it became impossible to ignore. The shape of his eyes, the structure of his jaw, the unmistakable traces of House Vale. How old was he? Theodore finally asked. Whitaker adjusted his glasses and looked toward the photograph. Approximately 17. Theodore nodded once. His attention never left the image. And when was this taken? 10 years ago. Silence followed. Calculations moved across Theodore's expression. Dates, timelines, possibilities. Lillian recognized the process by now. Theodore was assembling pieces, looking for the hidden pattern beneath the facts. Nathaniel folded his arms. If he was 17 then, he would be around 27 now. Theodore nodded. Approximately. Nathaniel looked toward the photograph again. The second survivor. Theodore remained silent for several moments, then slowly shook his head. Possibly. Nathaniel frowned. You disagree? Theodore finally lifted his gaze from the image. I disagree with certainty. The answer sounded familiar. It was exactly the kind of response Theodore gave whenever evidence remained incomplete. He refused assumptions, refused conclusions without proof. It was one of the reasons Lillian trusted him. Whitaker cleared his throat. The witness who provided the photograph remembers something else. Every head turned toward him. Theodore immediately focused. What? Whitaker opened a notebook. The woman in the photograph visited the church regularly. Lillian's pulse quickened. Abigail. Whitaker nodded. Yes. Theodore stepped closer. For how long? Several years. The room fell silent. Several years. Abigail had remained visible, accessible, existing within ordinary life while Theodore searched for shadows. The realization clearly bothered him. Lillian could see it. Theodore's jaw tightened slightly. Nothing more. Yet she knew him well enough now to recognize frustration when it appeared. Whitaker continued. According to the witness, she always arrived with the same young man. Nathaniel glanced toward the photograph. This one. Yes. Theodore looked toward the window. Charleston stretched beyond the glass. Busy streets, church steeples, harbor traffic. Somewhere inside that city, Abigail Hartwell had built an entirely new life, and somehow managed to remain hidden. Where did they live? Theodore asked. Whitaker's expression darkened. That is the problem. Theodore's eyes narrowed. What problem? Whitaker closed the notebook. Nobody knows. Silence settled over the room once more. Every answer seemed to arrive attached to another dead end. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. Convenient. Whitaker nodded reluctantly. Very. Theodore crossed toward the desk and collected the photograph. His attention lingered on Abigail's face, then shifted toward the young man standing beside her. Find the church. Whitaker blinked. What? Theodore held up the image. The building behind them. Understanding appeared immediately. Whitaker moved closer. Nathaniel joined him. Lillian followed. The photograph showed part of the entrance. Stonework. Decorative iron lanterns. A carved arch above the doorway. Theodore tapped one section near the edge of the frame. That crest. Whitaker leaned forward. His eyes widened slightly. I know that church. Theodore looked toward him. Where? 3 blocks from the old waterfront district. Hope moved instantly through the room. Small, fragile, yet real. Theodore's expression sharpened. Can we go there today? Whitaker checked his pocket watch. If we leave now. Theodore was already reaching for his coat. Less than 30 minutes later, they crossed Charleston in 2 separate carriages. The city felt different now. More focused. Every street seemed to hold possibility. Every unfamiliar face seemed capable of carrying answers. Lillian sat beside Theodore while the carriage rolled through increasingly narrow roads near the harbor district. Historic buildings crowded together. Brick facades weathered by time lined both sides of the street. Church bells echoed faintly in the distance. Theodore remained quiet throughout the journey. Not withdrawn. Concentrated. Lillian studied him occasionally. She could almost feel the tension beneath his calm exterior. 20 years. 20 years of searching. And now they were potentially following Abigail's footsteps directly. The church appeared at the end of a tree-lined avenue overlooking the harbor. The moment the carriage stopped, Whitaker pointed toward the stone entrance. That is it. Theodore stepped down immediately. Lillian followed. The church looked exactly like the photograph. Same archway, same lanterns, same carved details. A strange feeling moved through her chest. Abigail had stood here. The realization made the past feel unexpectedly close. Inside, the church was quiet. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows. Wooden pews stretched beneath high vaulted ceilings. The scent of old wood and candle wax lingered in the air. An elderly priest greeted them near the front of the sanctuary. Whitaker handled introductions. Theodore handled questions. The process had become familiar, efficient, precise. The priest listened carefully as Theodore presented the photograph. Recognition appeared almost immediately. Yes. The priest smiled faintly. I remember her. The room seemed to stop. Theodore's attention sharpened instantly. Abigail Hartwell? The priest nodded. Though she used another name. Silence followed. Nathaniel exchanged a glance with Lillian. Theodore remained perfectly still. What name? The priest thought for a moment. Mrs. Hale. Another false identity. Another layer of concealment. Theodore accepted it without visible surprise. And the young man? The priest looked toward the photograph again. His smile softened. Her son. Nobody spoke. The answer echoed through the church. Her son. Not nephew. Not ward. Son. Lillian looked toward Theodore. His expression revealed nothing. Yet she knew exactly what he was thinking. If the young man was Abigail's son, then he could not be the missing House Vale heir, unless something far more complicated existed beneath the surface. Theodore asked the next question immediately. Are you certain? The priest nodded. Absolutely. A strange mixture of relief and confusion moved through the group. One mystery had been answered. Another had taken its place. Nathaniel frowned. Then who was the second survivor? The priest looked puzzled. I am afraid I do not know. Theodore accepted the answer with a brief nod. Then he held up the photograph again. When did you last see Mrs. Hale? The priest's expression changed. Subtly. Yet enough. Theodore noticed at once. You remember. The elderly man hesitated. Yes. Theodore took one step closer. When? Silence lingered. Then finally the priest answered. 3 weeks ago. Every person in the church became still. Theodore's eyes darkened instantly. 3 weeks. The exact period when anonymous inquiries began appearing in trust records. The exact period when someone started moving pieces across the board. The priest continued quietly. She seemed worried. Theodore's voice lowered. About what? Someone was looking for her. The words landed like stones. Lillian felt her pulse quicken. Theodore remained motionless. Dangerous stillness. The kind she had learned to recognize. Did she say who? The priest slowly shook his head. No. Silence followed. Then the priest reached inside his coat and removed a folded envelope. However, Theodore's attention fixed on it immediately. The priest extended it toward him. She left this. Nobody breathed. Theodore accepted the envelope carefully. His name appeared across the front in elegant handwriting. Theodore Ravenshade. Lillian recognized the handwriting instantly. Abigail Hartwell. The church seemed impossibly quiet. Theodore stared at the envelope for several seconds. 20 years. 20 years of searching. And now Abigail had left a letter addressed directly to him. Nathaniel looked equally stunned. Whitaker removed his glasses entirely. The priest folded his hands. She said someone would eventually come. Theodore's gaze remained fixed on the envelope. Someone? The priest smiled faintly. A duke who never stopped looking. Silence crashed through the sanctuary. Lillian looked toward Theodore. For the first time since she met him, he appeared genuinely shaken. Not by danger. Not by mystery. By being seen. By the realization that Abigail knew exactly who had been searching all these years. Theodore slowly broke the seal. The paper inside unfolded with a soft crackle. His eyes moved across the first lines. Then stopped. Completely stopped. The color drained from his face. Lillian's heart lurched. Nathaniel stepped forward immediately. What is it? Theodore did not answer. He simply stared at the page. Finally, after several endless seconds, he lowered the letter and looked toward Lillian. Something raw lived in his eyes. Shock, grief, hope, all at once. Then he spoke words that changed everything. Abigail did not save one child from the fire. Silence swallowed the room. Theodore looked back toward the letter. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. She saved 3. The silence inside the church lasted so long that even the distant harbor sounds seemed to disappear. 3 children. Not 1. Not 2. 3. Theodore remained standing beneath the stained glass windows with Abigail Hartwell's letter in his hands. Afternoon light spilled across the page while everyone waited for him to continue. Lillian felt her pulse echoing through her chest. Nathaniel stood motionless beside the nearest pew. Whitaker had forgotten to put his glasses back on. Even the priest appeared unsettled by the revelation. Theodore lowered his gaze toward the letter once more. His expression remained unreadable. Yet something profound had shifted behind his eyes. Read it. Nathaniel's voice was quiet. Theodore nodded faintly, then began. If you are reading this, Theodore, then I have finally run out of time. The words settled softly through the sanctuary. Theodore continued reading. I know you never stopped searching. I know because I never stopped watching. Lillian felt her breath catch. Theodore's jaw tightened slightly. You were always easier to find than you realized. Every year you returned to Charleston. Every year you followed the same clues. Every year you came closer. Silence followed. Theodore lowered the page briefly. Not because he wished to stop, because the words clearly carried more weight than anyone else could understand. Then he continued. You deserved the truth long ago. I simply could not risk it. Too many people were watching. Too many people were waiting for Eleanor to be found. Nathaniel folded his arms. She knew. Theodore did not answer. His attention remained fixed on the letter. The fire was never about property. Never about money. Those were only excuses. The atmosphere inside the church changed instantly. Every person present felt it. Theodore's voice lowered. The fire began because someone discovered what Charlotte Vale intended to reveal. Lillian stared at him. Her mother's name seemed to echo through the sanctuary. Theodore read further. Charlotte learned that several trustees connected to House Vale had been stealing from the family for years. She planned to expose them publicly. She never got the chance. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Theodore continued. When the fire happened, I realized the children would never be safe if anyone believed they survived. Lillian felt cold move through her chest. Children. Plural. Theodore's eyes moved steadily across the page. Eleanor was not the only target. Neither was James. Nathaniel frowned immediately. James. Theodore nodded once. The second survivor. The name settled heavily across the room. A name at last. Not merely an unidentified child hidden inside altered records. A real person. Theodore continued reading. James Vale was Charlotte's nephew. 7 years old. Quiet. Intelligent. Too observant for his own safety. Whitaker exchanged a glance with Nathaniel. Theodore's expression darkened slightly. The third child was never connected to House Vale by blood. Yet he was in equal danger. Silence followed. Theodore read the next sentence. Then stopped. Completely stopped. Lillian saw something flash across his face. Shock. Genuine shock. What? Nathaniel stepped forward. Theodore slowly lowered the letter. The boy in the photograph. The room seemed to narrow. What about him? Theodore looked toward Nathaniel. Then toward Lillian. He was not Abigail's son. Silence crashed through the church. Nathaniel stared at him. Then who was he? Theodore lifted the letter again. His name was Samuel Hart. The answer meant nothing at first. Then Theodore continued. He was the son of one of Charlotte's accountants. Lillian frowned. Theodore read directly from the page. His father uncovered evidence of the theft. Both parents disappeared shortly afterward. The implications landed immediately. Samuel had become another witness. Another loose end. Another child someone might have wanted removed from the story. Theodore continued. Abigail took all 3 children because she believed none of them would survive otherwise. The sanctuary remained utterly silent. Lillian struggled to absorb the scale of it. 3 children hidden. 3 lives erased from official history. 3 futures shaped by a decision made during one terrible night. Theodore folded the first page and moved to the second. I separated them deliberately. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. Theodore continued. The children could never remain together. Too many people knew their faces. Too many records connected them. If one identity was discovered, the others would fall. Lillian looked toward the stained glass windows. Suddenly everything made sense. The false names, the missing records, the hidden trust. 20 years of secrecy had not been random. It had been protection. Theodore read further. Eleanor was placed with Edgar Vailcrest because he agreed to hide her. The room became very still. Theodore's eyes hardened. For money. Nathaniel muttered something under his breath. Nobody disagreed. Theodore continued. At first he honored the arrangement. Eventually greed changed him. Lillian closed her eyes briefly. The words hurt. Not because they surprised her. Because they confirmed what she already feared. Edgar had chosen money over loyalty. Again and again. Theodore moved farther down the page. James remained under my supervision until adulthood. He eventually learned the truth. Whitaker blinked. She knew where he was. Theodore nodded. Apparently. Nathaniel looked toward him. Is he alive? Theodore returned to the letter. Yes. Hope flickered through the room immediately. Theodore continued reading. James now lives under another name. He has spent years gathering evidence against the people responsible for the theft. Lillian felt her pulse accelerate. Evidence. At last. Theodore's expression sharpened. He is the one who accessed the trust account. Nathaniel straightened immediately. Not the conspirators. Theodore shook his head. No. Relief moved visibly across several faces. One mystery solved. Theodore continued. James knew Eleanor would eventually return. He prepared for it. Lillian stared at the letter. Somewhere inside Charleston, another survivor had been waiting for her. The realization felt almost impossible. Theodore turned to the final page. The atmosphere changed again. Something in his expression warned her before he spoke a single word. What is it? Theodore looked toward her. For a moment he seemed uncertain whether to continue. Then he read aloud. Theodore, if Eleanor is standing beside you while you read this, tell her I never abandoned her. Lillian felt her throat tighten instantly. Theodore's voice remained steady. Tell her every birthday was remembered. Every Christmas. Every year. The church blurred slightly. She lowered her eyes. Theodore continued anyway. Tell her the silver lily was always meant to bring her home. Silence followed. Deep. Emotional. Human. No one interrupted. Theodore's gaze remained fixed on the page. And tell her Charlotte loved her beyond measure. Lillian swallowed hard. The words landed somewhere deep inside her chest. A place untouched by documents or investigations or inheritance disputes. A place that simply wanted to know she had been loved. Theodore slowly lowered the letter. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally the priest cleared his throat softly. There is more, I believe. Theodore frowned slightly. More. The priest pointed toward the bottom corner of the final page. Theodore looked down. A separate note had been attached, folded smaller than the rest. His expression changed instantly. Nathaniel noticed. What? Theodore unfolded the additional sheet. The handwriting remained Abigail's. Yet the message was shorter. Much shorter. Theodore read silently, then went completely still. Lillian's pulse quickened. Theodore. He looked up slowly. Something had returned to his eyes. Not grief. Not hope. Urgency. Pure urgency. Abigail left an address. The room came alive immediately. Nathaniel stepped forward. Whitaker did the same. Theodore held up the note. She wanted us to find it only after reading everything else. Lillian moved closer. Theodore handed her the page. A Charleston address had been written neatly across the center. Nothing more. No explanation. No warning. Just a location. Nathaniel looked toward the nearest window. How far? Whitaker answered immediately. 10 minutes. Theodore was already folding the letter. Every trace of emotional vulnerability vanished beneath action. Beneath purpose. The Duke returned. Focused. Determined. Ready. Yet before he turned away, his eyes briefly met Lillian's. The look lasted only a moment. Long enough for her to understand something important. 20 years of searching had finally led somewhere real. Not a rumor. Not a theory. Not a dead end. A destination. Person. A truth waiting behind an actual door. Minutes later they emerged from the church into the fading afternoon light. Charleston stretched around them beneath gathering clouds. The harbor wind carried the scent of rain. Theodore stepped into the carriage first. Nathaniel followed. Whitaker climbed aboard the second vehicle. Lillian paused only long enough to look back toward the church entrance. Toward the place where Abigail's letter had finally spoken after 2 decades of silence. Then she entered the carriage beside Theodore. The horses started forward immediately. The city blurred past outside the windows. Neither she nor Theodore spoke during the journey. Words felt unnecessary now. The address waited ahead. Answers waited ahead. Perhaps Abigail herself. Charleston streets narrowed as they moved deeper into one of the oldest districts near the waterfront. Brick buildings crowded close together. Shadows stretched across cobblestones. The carriage eventually slowed, then stopped. Theodore looked through the window. His expression became unreadable. Lillian followed his gaze. A modest three-story building stood at the end of the street. Nothing remarkable, nothing grand. Yet one detail immediately captured her attention. A silver lily had been painted discreetly beside the front door. The same symbol, the same flower, the same promise carried through 20 years. Theodore opened the carriage door without hesitation. The others followed. Wind moved softly through the street as they approached the entrance. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Theodore reached the door first. His hand closed around the brass handle. Then he stopped. Not from fear. From realization. 20 years. Every search. Every failure. Every clue. Every promise. All of it had led to this moment. Slowly he turned the handle. The door swung inward. And from somewhere inside the building, a woman's voice called out before any of them could speak. Theodore Ravenshade. The sound froze everyone in place. Because after 20 years, Abigail Hartwell already knew he had arrived. For a moment nobody moved. The voice seemed to exist outside time itself. Theodore stood in the doorway with one hand still resting on the brass handle. Lillian felt her pulse hammering against her ribs. Nathaniel had gone completely still. Even Whitaker appeared stunned. The woman inside the building spoke again. You took longer than I expected. The voice was older now, softer than it might have been 20 years earlier, yet unmistakably confident, unmistakably certain. Theodore stepped across the threshold first. The others followed. The interior resembled a private residence rather than an office. Warm light filled a modest sitting room. Books lined several walls. Fresh flowers rested near the windows overlooking Charleston Harbor. Nothing about the space suggested secrecy. Nothing suggested 20 years of hiding. Yet the silver lilies appeared everywhere. On framed artwork, on embroidered cushions, on a small porcelain vase beside the fireplace. Lillian's eyes immediately found the woman standing near the far window. Age had touched her hair with silver. Fine lines surrounded her eyes. Yet there was no mistaking her. The photographs had prepared them. The hidden letters had prepared them. Even so, seeing her in person felt unreal. Abigail Hartwell. Alive. After 20 years. Silence filled the room. Abigail's gaze moved first toward Theodore. Not Lillian. Theodore. Something softened in her expression. Not surprise. Recognition. Deep and personal. You found her. Theodore stared at her for several seconds before answering. Yes. His voice sounded rougher than usual. Abigail nodded once, as though confirming something she had known all along. Then her attention shifted toward Lillian. The room seemed to disappear. Lillian could not breathe, could not think. The woman who carried her from the fire. The woman who vanished. The woman whose choices shaped her entire life. Abigail's eyes glistened faintly. Hello, Eleanor. The name hit harder than expected. Not because it was unfamiliar anymore. Because of who spoke it. Lillian felt emotion rise suddenly inside her chest. Too much emotion. Too many years. Too many unanswered questions. You left me. The words escaped before she could stop them. Silence followed. Painful silence. Abigail accepted the accusation without defense. Without anger. Yes. Lillian blinked. The answer surprised her. Abigail continued quietly. I did. Theodore remained motionless. Watching. Not interfering. Abigail folded her hands together. And I hated every day of it. Lillian looked away briefly. The honesty made everything harder. Much harder. She had expected explanations. Excuses. Rationalizations. Instead she found regret. Genuine regret. Abigail crossed the room slowly. Not close enough to intrude. Close enough to be heard. There was never a day I forgot you. Her voice trembled slightly. Not one. Lillian swallowed hard. Abigail's eyes filled with emotion she no longer seemed interested in hiding. I know I do not deserve forgiveness. Silence settled between them. But I need you to know that leaving was never abandonment. Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. He understood. Perhaps better than anyone. Abigail turned toward him briefly. You understand that, do you not? Theodore's expression became unreadable. I understand impossible choices. The answer hung quietly in the room. Abigail nodded. Gratitude flickered across her face. Then she looked toward Nathaniel and Whitaker. "Please sit." Nobody moved immediately. The moment felt too significant, too fragile. Eventually Theodore crossed toward a nearby chair. Lillian sat beside him. The others followed. Abigail remained standing for several seconds before finally lowering herself into a chair opposite them. Evening sunlight streamed through the windows behind her. For the first time she looked tired. Not weak, not defeated, simply tired. The exhaustion of carrying secrets for 2 decades. Theodore spoke first. "The letter." Abigail nodded. "Yes. Why now?" Her gaze shifted toward the harbor beyond the windows. "Because the people responsible finally made a mistake." Nathaniel leaned forward immediately. "The trustees." Abigail looked toward him. "Not all of them." Theodore's attention sharpened. "There are still survivors." Abigail nodded once. 3. The room became silent. Theodore exchanged a glance with Nathaniel. Abigail continued. "The theft was larger than anyone realized." She looked toward Lillian. "Your mother discovered it accidentally." Charlotte again. Always Charlotte at the center of everything. Abigail's expression softened. "She trusted the wrong people." Theodore's eyes darkened. "Names." Abigail hesitated, then slowly shook her head. "Not yet." Nathaniel looked frustrated. Theodore looked thoughtful. Abigail noticed both reactions. "If I give you names before you understand the full story, you will move too quickly." Theodore almost smiled. "Almost. You assume I would." Abigail actually smiled. The first genuine smile since they arrived. "I have known you since you were 10. Even Theodore could not argue with that. A strange warmth entered the room. Brief. Unexpected. Then Abigail's expression grew serious once more. She looked directly at Lillian. "There is something you deserve to know before anything else." Lillian felt her pulse quicken. Abigail reached toward a small wooden box resting on a nearby table. She lifted it carefully and placed it in her lap. The box appeared old, well preserved, important. Abigail's fingers lingered on the lid. "Charlotte gave this to me 3 days before the fire." The room became very still. Abigail opened the box. Inside rested several letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. A photograph, and a small gold locket. Lillian stared at the contents. Abigail lifted the photograph first, then handed it toward her. Lillian accepted it carefully. The image showed a young woman standing beside a fountain. Dark hair, warm smile, intelligent eyes. Charlotte Vale. For the first time in her life, Lillian looked directly into her mother's face. Emotion hit instantly, powerful and unexpected. Theodore watched quietly, saying nothing, giving her space. Abigail's voice softened. She carried that photograph everywhere. Lillian could not look away. The resemblance was undeniable. Not perfect, but undeniable. Charlotte's eyes, Charlotte's smile. Pieces of herself she never understood suddenly made sense. Abigail reached into the box again. This time she lifted the gold locket. "This belongs to you." Lillian accepted it with trembling fingers. The metal felt warm despite its age. She opened it carefully. Inside rested 2 miniature portraits. Charlotte on one side, a man she did not recognize on the other. "My father." Abigail nodded. "William Vale." Silence followed. Lillian stared at the tiny image. Another face. Another piece of family returned after 20 years. Abigail watched her carefully, then looked toward Theodore. "There is one more thing." Theodore's attention immediately sharpened. Abigail folded her hands together. For the first time since they arrived, uncertainty appeared across her face. Real uncertainty. "James knows you are here." Nathaniel straightened immediately. Theodore remained still. "Where is he?" Abigail hesitated. "Close." Theodore's eyes narrowed slightly. "How close?" Abigail exhaled slowly, then answered. "Closer than you think." Confusion moved through the room. Theodore noticed. So did Nathaniel. Abigail looked toward the front window overlooking the street. "He has been watching for 3 days." Silence crashed down. Theodore's expression hardened instantly. Nathaniel rose from his chair. Whitaker followed. Lillian felt cold spread through her chest. "Watching." 3 days. Abigail nodded toward the window. He wanted to be certain Eleanor was safe before revealing himself. Theodore crossed toward the glass immediately. The others followed. Evening shadows stretched across the street outside. Pedestrians moved along the sidewalks. Carriages rolled past. Nothing appeared unusual. Then Abigail spoke again. Very quietly. Too late. Theodore turned sharply. Abigail had gone pale. Her attention remained fixed on something outside. Everyone followed her gaze. A black carriage had just stopped across the street. Not remarkable by itself, except for the silver crest painted discreetly on the door. Nathaniel's face lost color instantly. Theodore's expression turned to stone. Lillian looked from one man to the other. "What is it?" Neither answered immediately. Abigail did. Her voice barely above a whisper. "One of the trustees." The room fell silent. Outside, the carriage door slowly opened, and for the first time in 20 years, the people responsible for destroying Housevale had arrived in person. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The room remained frozen around the window while the black carriage waited across the street. Evening shadows stretched across Charleston's waterfront district. Harbor winds carried the scent of salt and rain through a slightly open pane. Theodore stood closest to the glass. His expression had become completely unreadable. Lillian had seen that look before. Whenever Theodore reached this level of control, it meant he was thinking 3 moves ahead. Nathaniel's attention remained fixed on the carriage crest. The color had not returned to his face. Abigail looked older suddenly. Not physically, emotionally, as though 20 years of vigilance had finally caught up with her. "Who is it?" Lillian asked quietly. Abigail did not look away from the street. "Richard Holloway." The name meant nothing to Lillian. The reaction from everyone else said otherwise. Theodore's jaw tightened faintly. Nathaniel folded his arms. Whitaker muttered something under his breath. Abigail continued. "He was one of the trustees Charlotte trusted most." Silence followed. Theodore finally spoke. "And one of the men stealing from Housevale." Abigail nodded once. "Yes." Outside, the carriage door opened fully. An older gentleman stepped onto the sidewalk. Gray-haired, impeccably dressed, distinguished enough to disappear into any gathering of Charleston's elite. He looked nothing like a villain, nothing like a man connected to decades of lies. Yet the atmosphere inside the room changed the moment he appeared. Theodore studied him carefully. "He came alone." Abigail shook her head. "No." Theodore glanced toward her. Abigail pointed toward 2 figures standing farther down the street near a newspaper stand, then another near the corner. Watching, waiting. Theodore noticed immediately. Not alone. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. "They know." Abigail's eyes filled with regret. "Yes." Theodore turned away from the window. Decision settled across his features. Fast, precise, certain. "How many exits?" Abigail answered immediately. 3. Theodore nodded once. "Good." Lillian already recognized the shift. The conversation had ended. Action had begun. Yet before anyone moved, a knock echoed through the front door below. One knock, calm, deliberate. Not the knock of a man uncertain whether he was welcome. Silence followed. Then another knock. Theodore looked toward Abigail. "How long before he realizes we are here?" Abigail managed a faint smile. "He already knows." Nobody argued, because it was obviously true. The second knock echoed again. Theodore crossed toward the center of the room. "We are done hiding." The words settled heavily through the space. Abigail stared at him for several seconds, then slowly nodded. Not agreement, recognition. She had waited 20 years for someone willing to say exactly that. Nathaniel straightened. Whitaker looked nervous. Lillian felt her pulse quicken. Theodore's attention shifted toward her. Immediately the intensity in his expression softened. Just slightly. "Enough. You do not have to be part of this conversation." Lillian almost laughed. After everything, after hidden identities, missing heirs, burned histories, lost families, there was no version of this story where she stood outside the room now. "Yes." Her voice remained steady. "I do." Something warm flickered briefly behind Theodore's eyes. Pride, perhaps, respect. Then it disappeared beneath focus. Another knock echoed from downstairs. Theodore looked toward Nathaniel. "Stay with Abigail." Nathaniel nodded. Theodore looked toward Whitaker. "Call the authorities if necessary." Whitaker appeared relieved to receive instructions. Theodore finally looked back toward Lillian. The silence between them lasted only seconds. Yet it felt longer. 20 years of searching had brought them here. Not just answers. Truth. Theodore offered his hand. The gesture surprised her. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was simple, natural, certain. Lillian accepted it without hesitation. Together they descended the staircase. The old wooden steps creaked softly beneath their feet. Evening light filtered through narrow windows. Somewhere above, Abigail waited. Somewhere outside, Richard Holloway stood at the door. The distance between past and present had never felt smaller. Theodore released her hand only when they reached the entrance hall. Then he opened the front door. Richard Holloway stood on the threshold. His expression remained calm, polite even, yet his eyes immediately found Lillian. The reaction was unmistakable. Shock, real shock, not because she was alive, because she was standing openly beside Theodore Ravenshade. Richard recovered quickly. Too quickly. Years of practice, perhaps. Miss Vale. The name sounded strange coming from him. Theodore stepped slightly forward. Not enough to block Lillian. Enough to make a point. Richard noticed. "Your Grace." Theodore's voice remained calm. "Mr. Holloway." Silence settled between them. Richard's gaze shifted briefly toward the staircase leading upstairs. Then back toward Theodore. "I believe we have matters to discuss." Theodore's expression remained unreadable. "We do." Richard smiled faintly. "Then perhaps we should stop pretending." The words landed with surprising force. Theodore folded his arms. "By all means." Richard's eyes moved toward Lillian again. This time there was no attempt to disguise the emotion behind them. Regret. Genuine regret. "You resemble your mother." Lillian felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The same words. Different man. Different meaning. Richard lowered his gaze briefly. "Charlotte deserved better than what happened." Theodore's eyes turned cold. "Interesting statement." Richard accepted the criticism without complaint. "Accurate statement." Silence followed. Then unexpectedly, Richard reached inside his coat. Every person in the room became alert. He withdrew not a weapon, not a threat, a sealed envelope. Theodore remained still. Richard extended it toward Lillian. This belonged to Charlotte. Nobody moved for several seconds. Finally Theodore accepted the envelope first. His eyes examined the seal. Then he handed it to Lillian. The wax carried the crest of House Vale. Unbroken, untouched. Her pulse accelerated. Richard watched quietly. "She left it with me 3 days before the fire." Theodore's expression hardened. "You waited 20 years." Richard nodded once. "Because she instructed me to." Silence followed. Lillian stared at the envelope. Another letter. Another voice from the past. Yet somehow this felt different. More personal. More final. Theodore noticed her hesitation immediately. "Open it." She nodded. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The paper unfolded carefully. Elegant handwriting covered the page. Charlotte Vale. Lillian recognized it instantly from other documents. The first line blurred almost immediately. "My dearest Eleanor." Emotion struck harder than expected. Theodore moved closer without speaking. Close enough that she felt steady. Charlotte's words continued. "If you are reading this, then life has been far more complicated than I hoped." A small laugh escaped through unexpected tears. The letter continued. "I do not know what kind of woman you have become. I only know that you will become one." Lillian swallowed hard. The room seemed to disappear around her. There was only the page. Only her mother's voice reaching across 2 decades. "Do not let other people's choices determine your worth. People will disappoint you. Some will betray you. Some will fail you. Yet love remains worth giving anyway." Theodore lowered his eyes briefly. Richard looked away toward the street. Even Nathaniel, standing at the bottom of the staircase now, remained silent. Charlotte's words filled the house. "If Theodore Ravenshade is beside you, then trust him. The sentence stole the air from the room. Lillian froze. Theodore froze. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Charlotte knew. Somehow she knew. The letter continued. He notices what others miss. He keeps promises long after everyone else forgets them. And if he is still protecting you after all these years, then he is protecting you because he chooses to, not because he must. Silence followed. Deep and complete. Lillian slowly lowered the page. She could not look at Theodore immediately. The emotion felt too large, too overwhelming. Yet when she finally lifted her eyes, he was already watching her. Not demanding anything. Not expecting anything. Simply there. The way he always had been. The way he always would be. Richard quietly cleared his throat. The moment softened but did not disappear. There is one final truth you deserve. Theodore's attention shifted immediately. Richard reached into his coat once more and removed a small leather ledger. Worn, ancient, important. He handed it toward Theodore. Every stolen transaction, every hidden account, every trustee involved. Whitaker stepped forward in disbelief. Nathaniel stared. Abigail slowly descended the staircase behind them. Richard looked toward her. No anger existed between them. Only exhaustion. I should have stopped them years ago. Abigail nodded sadly. Yes. Richard accepted the judgment. Theodore opened the ledger. His eyes moved across the entries. Then he stopped. Nathaniel noticed first. What? Theodore looked up slowly. Surprise touched his expression. Then satisfaction. Deep satisfaction. We have everything. Silence followed. Then understanding spread through the room. Names. Evidence. Records. Proof. After 20 years, the truth finally existed in one place. Complete. Undeniable. Abigail closed her eyes briefly. Relief moved across her face. Richard looked older somehow. Lighter too. As though carrying the burden had become more difficult than surrendering it. Theodore closed the ledger. His gaze moved toward Lillian. Then Abigail. Then the others. It is over. The words settled softly through the house. Nobody celebrated immediately. The moment felt too significant. Too human. 20 years of fear. 20 years of secrets. 20 years of searching. Ending not with triumph, but with truth. Outside, evening sunlight broke through the clouds above Charleston Harbor. Golden light filled the windows. Lillian looked down at Charlotte's letter one final time, then folded it carefully against her heart. She no longer felt invisible, no longer lost, no longer uncertain where she belonged. Eleanor Vale had come home, and standing beside her was the man who never stopped looking.